Bedtime Reading. Pride and Prejudice. Chapter 1. A Young Man of Fortune. It is well known throughout the world that a single man wants to marry a wife, especially if he is rich and successful. Certainly, a mother of 5 daughters who are old enough to marry also thinks a lot about marriage. When she hears that a wealthy man has moved into her neighborhood, she will surely think of him as a future husband for one of her daughters. This was the view of Mrs. Bennet of Longbourn House, which is near Meryton in Hertfordshire. Mrs. Bennet had heard the news in February 1810 that a single wealthy man was moving near them. Excited by the opportunity, she decided to tell her husband. "My dear Mr. Bennet," she said to her husband, "do you know that someone is finally renting Netherfield Park?" Mr. Bennet was silent and did not answer her. "Don't you want to know who is there?" cried his wife impatiently.
"Well, I'm sure you want to tell me."
"Well," Mrs. Bennet said excitedly, "Netherfield is being rented by Mr. Bingley. He is a young, wealthy man from the north."
"You don't say,"
Mr. Bennet replied.
"Is he married or single?"
"Oh, single, my dear," cried Mrs. Bennet excitedly. "What a good fortune for our daughters!"
"What do you mean by that? What does this have to do with their fortune?"
"Oh, don't be so difficult, my dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife. "I'm just thinking that perhaps Mr. Bingley might marry one of our daughters."
"Is this why he has rented the house?"
her husband asked jokingly. "What nonsense! Still, it's likely that if he meets one of our girls, he'll fall in love. So you must go and pay him a visit soon. It's the only respectable way for an introduction." Mr. Bennet stood up and looked at his wife.
"I do not want to do that, and you cannot make me, I promise you."
"But what about the future of your daughters?" cried his wife, shocked.
"I don't see why I must visit him,"
said Mr. Bennet. "How difficult you are!" she cried. "I cannot take the girls to visit him unless you have already met him. It's the only correct way."
"That's not true at all,"
said Mr. Bennet calmly.
"I will write this young man a letter. I will tell him he has my permission to marry whichever of our daughters he chooses, and I'll make sure that I say something very good about my little Lizzie."
"You will not do such a thing!" cried his wife angrily. "Anyway, Elizabeth is no better than our other daughters."
"Our daughters,"
replied Mr. Bennet,
"haven't much in way of praise or recommendation. They don't know very much and are often silly, like other girls. But Lizzie is more clever and smarter than her sisters."
"Mr. Bennet, how you make me worry! Sometimes I feel you even enjoy it. You don't care about my poor nerves." Mr. Bennet walked over to the door of his library.
"You are wrong, my dear,"
he said.
"I do have feelings for your nerves. After all, they are like old friends. I have lived with them for 20 years.
"Oh," said Mrs. Bennet. She was beginning to cry. "How you enjoy making me worry!"
You will have many other chances to see rich young men move into our neighborhood, my dear. So I hope you can forget this."
"You have no thought for your daughters. 5 of them. 5! And Jane in her 23rd year. Are they all to be old maids and never get married?"
"I'm sure you won't let this happen,"
he said, and the library door closed behind him. The Bennet family met together in the drawing-room after dinner that evening. 4 of Mr. Bennet's daughters were quite pretty. Jane was the most beautiful of them, but Elizabeth, who was 20, had more spirit. Also, Elizabeth's fine dark eyes seemed full of light. Kitty was their 17-year-old daughter. She was pretty in a thin way. Lydia was almost 16, and she was tall, with healthy, red-colored cheeks. 19-year-old Mary was the only plain member of the family. She was thin, round-shouldered, and near-sighted. Because she read too many books, she had to wear glasses. Elizabeth was busy working on a hat when Mr. Bennet said to her,
"I hope our new neighbor, Mr. Bingley, will like it."
"And how are we to know whether Mr. Bingley likes it or not," asked her mother, "if we cannot visit him?" "Don't worry, Mamma. You forget that we shall see him at the town meeting," Elizabeth said. "Lady Lucas will introduce us to Mr. Bingley if you ask her," said Jane. "Lady Lucas," said Mrs. Bennet, without any hope, "has her own daughter. She'll want him to meet her." "That's not a very nice thing to say about her, Mamma," said Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet threw up her arms and turned angrily to Elizabeth. "Do not speak back to me, Elizabeth," she cried. "My nerves will not stand it. A friendly introduction at a public meeting will not be as good as your papa introducing himself. He has no thought for your future at all." She looked angrily across the room at her husband. "How can we convince you to visit Mr. Bingley, Papa?" asked Elizabeth nicely. She hoped to change her father's mind. "Please do," said Jane. "Oh, yes, sir, I beg you," requested Lydia. "Leave me out of this request, Papa," said Mary coldly. "I don't wish to go chasing after Mr. Bingley." Mr. Bennet looked from one daughter to the other.
"I've already told you. I'm not going to call on Mr. Bingley,"
he said. "You see," cried Mrs. Bennet. "He doesn't care. Oh, my poor head!" But Mrs. Bennet's complaining had no effect on her husband. Since she was still upset, she began to yell at one of her daughters. "By heavens! Stop coughing, Kitty! You will tear my poor nerves apart." "Do you think I cough because I like to, Mamma?" said Kitty.
"Please, Kitty, your mother's being difficult,"
remarked Mr. Bennet.
"Let us talk a little more about Mr. Bingley."
"No, no," cried his wife. "No more about Mr. Bingley."
"I'm quite sorry to hear that, my dear,"
said her husband. He was enjoying himself very much.
"Why didn't you tell me this before?"
Mr. Bennet said jokingly.
"If I had known, I wouldn't have gone to visit him yesterday morning."
"What?" cried Mrs. Bennet. "You went to visit him?" "Oh, Papa!" exclaimed Jane, Elizabeth, Kitty, and Lydia, all at the same time. "But, my dear, you said so strongly that you would not go," said his wife.
"That's because I had already done so, you see."
"Oh, how good of you, my dear! I knew you loved your daughters too much to miss the opportunity to meet with such a man of good fortune. What a good joke to play on us! Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet, how very happy I am!"
"Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you need to,"
said Mr. Bennet as he left the room. He was very tired after dealing with his wife. "What a fine, thoughtful father you have, girls," said Mrs. Bennet after the door was shut. For the rest of the evening, the girls and their mother wondered how soon it would be before Mr. Bingley returned their father's visit. Chapter 2. A Young Man of Proud Manners. Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit after a few days. They sat together about 10 minutes in the library. Mr. Bingley had hoped to see the daughters. He had heard that they were very beautiful. However, he was only able to see the father. Mr. Bennet would not tell his daughters about the young man, but they had information from Elizabeth's friend, Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte said that Mr. Bingley was very handsome, and he had a very nice personality. Most importantly, he was planning to go to the next dance in Meryton. The girls all looked forward to the dance, for dancing was often a sure step towards falling in love. On the night of the dance, Mr. Bingley came with his single sister, Caroline, his married sister, Mrs. Hurst, and another young man. Charles Bingley was indeed very good-looking and had easy, friendly manners. Everyone was interested in his friend, Mr. Darcy. He was a fine, tall man. His face was handsome, and he seemed very noble. There was a rumour that he owned a large piece of land at Pemberley in Derbyshire. Later, everyone discovered that he was proud, rude, and thought that other people were not as good as him. Mr. Bingley, on the other hand, was lively and not shy. He danced every dance, and seemed disappointed when it was time for the dance to finish. What a difference with his friend! Mr. Darcy only danced once with Mr. Bingley's sister. He didn't even ask to be introduced to any other lady. At the dance, it was decided that he was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world. During the dance, Elizabeth had been to sit down for 2 dances. Mr. Darcy had been standing near her, and she was able to listen to a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley.
"Come on, Darcy,"
he said.
"Don't stand here by yourself. Wouldn't it be better if you were to dance some more? Your sisters are dancing with other partners, and you are dancing with the only beautiful girl in the room,"
said Mr. Darcy, looking across at Jane.
"Oh, she is most beautiful. But one of her sisters is sitting behind you, and she is also very pretty. Let me ask Jane to introduce you."
Darcy turned around and looked at Elizabeth until Elizabeth turned to look at him. Catching her eye, he stopped and coldly said,
"She is not pretty enough for me to dance with her."
Mr. Darcy walked off, leaving Elizabeth feeling hurt. She certainly had no friendly feelings for him. Mrs. Bennet, who had also heard Mr. Darcy's remark, was very angry. Still, the whole evening passed very pleasantly enough for the rest of the family. Mrs. Bennet was happy because her eldest daughter Jane was much admired by the Netherfield party. Mary had heard herself mentioned as the most educated girl in the neighbourhood, and Kitty and Lydia were always dancing with partners through the evening. Because of this, they returned home to Longbourn in good and happy spirits. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," cried his wife as she entered the room. "What a delightful evening! Jane was so admired. Mr. Bingley said she was quite beautiful. She was the only lady in the room that he danced with twice." Mrs. Bennet then told him about how rude, proud, and hurtful Mr. Darcy had been. "I wish you had been there to give him a piece of your mind." It was easy, during the next few weeks, for Elizabeth to know that Mr. Charles Bingley was becoming very fond of Jane. Jane, for her part, returned his warm feelings. Because she was busy watching Mr. Bingley pay attention to her sister, Elizabeth was too busy to guess that she was receiving the attention of Mr. Darcy. Though he had looked at her without any feeling at the dance, he began to notice the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. They made her face seem uncommonly intelligent. He was also forced to admit that her figure was both light and attractive. Her easy and playful manner was also attractive. But Elizabeth remained unaware. One night, Sir William Lucas had a large party at his house. Mr. Darcy was standing near Elizabeth when Sir William came near.
"What a pleasant thing dancing is for young people,"
said Sir William.
"One must know how to dance in order to be part of high-standing society." "True,"
replied Mr. Darcy.
"but dancing is also fashionable in other kinds of societies in the world. Even uneducated people can dance."
Sir William only smiled at Mr. Darcy's cold remark. At that moment Elizabeth turned around, and he called to her.
"My dear Miss Elizabeth, why is it you are not dancing? Mr. Darcy, please allow me to introduce this young lady to you as a very pretty and delightful dancing partner."
Taking her hand, he would have given it to Mr. Darcy, but Elizabeth suddenly stepped back. "Indeed, sir, you must not believe that I am standing here to look for a partner. In fact, I do not want to dance." Then Mr. Darcy tried very hard to ask her to dance, but Elizabeth would not agree and turned away. Mr. Darcy was still looking at her when she turned away. Suddenly he found Bingley's sister, Miss Caroline Bingley, beside him. "I'm sure you are thinking how boring it would be if you had to spend all your evenings with these country people."
"Actually, you are quite wrong. I was just thinking about how pleasurable it is to see such fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman."
"Oh," said Miss Bingley, surprised. "And which lady has given you such an idea?"
"Miss Elizabeth Bennet."
"How long has she been such a favourite of yours? This is quite unexpected. When can I wish you happiness together?"
"Sometimes your imagination is too quick,"
replied Darcy coldly.
"It jumps from high to low, from love to marriage in a single moment."
"Well, you will have a horrible mother-in-law indeed. She will be perfect for you, indeed," said Miss Bingley hatefully. He paid no attention to her, but continued to look at Elizabeth across the room. Chapter 3. A Young Man Searching for a Wife. The village of Longbourn was located about a mile from Meryton, where the Bennet daughters had an aunt. Being such a short distance, they often walked to call upon Mrs. Phillips, their aunt. Recently, the two youngest members of the Bennet family were going to Meryton very often. The arrival in Meryton of military soldiers attracted Kitty and Lydia. Their uncle, Mr. Phillips, knew all the officers. Most of them were quite often visiting at his house. Soon, Kitty and Lydia got to know the officers, too. In their eyes, Mr. Bingley's large fortune and wealth meant nothing, since he did not wear the red coat of a military man. One morning, the day after another dance in Meryton, the two youngest sisters were telling their mother and sisters the wonderful experiences of the night before. "We danced every dance," said Lydia joyfully. "We spoke to every officer in the room," added Kitty. Mr. Bennet appeared at the library door without being seen. He was holding a letter while he entered into the room. He said coolly,
"You two must be two of the silliest girls in the country."
"Oh, Mr. Bennet," replied Mrs. Bennet, "I remember very well when I liked men in red coats myself."
"Please, I beg you to leave out the details,"
said Mr. Bennet.
"I do not wish to hear your clever speech on the charms of the military. I want to tell you about this letter. We are soon to receive a visitor."
"It is Mr. Bingley?" asked Mrs. Bennet, greatly satisfied. "Why, Jane, you never said anything about this."
"Heavens!"
cried Mr. Bennet.
"Do you think there is only one man in this world? It is not Mr. Bingley."
"Is he an officer, Papa?" asked Lydia eagerly. "Is he young?" queried Kitty. "Do we know him, Papa?" asked Elizabeth.
"He is a gentleman whom I have never seen before in my whole life. He wants to stay here with us for 2 weeks.
For 2 weeks? Asked Mrs. Bennet. A total stranger. How strange. But is he rich, my dear?
Probably not, because he works for the church.
Oh, said Lydia, sadly disappointed. He works for the church?
Ah, but he will be given property after his parents die,
said Mr. Bennet.
He is a young man of expected wealth.
Mrs. Bennet's face brightened. And is he single?
Yes, my dear, he is,
Mr. Bennet replied.
But I don't think he'll be able to stay single for long after he enters this house with all of you.
A young churchman who will soon own a lot of property, thought Mrs. Bennet. Well, I shall be very glad to see him.
I'm glad,
said her husband jokingly.
You are so ready to welcome Mr. Collins to our home.
What? Cried his wife. She was in shock. Oh, so it's Mr. Collins, your cousin, Papa. Won't he receive this property after your death? Asked Elizabeth.
Yes, you're right. It is that Mr. Collins. You should be very kind to him,
continued Mr. Bennet smoothly.
When I'm dead, he will decide if you must leave this house.
Please do not talk of that man, said Mrs. Bennet. It is not right or correct that your property be taken away from your own children and given to another relative. Well, there is nothing we can do about it, Mamma, said Jane. She and Elizabeth had often tried to explain to their mother that females were not able to own property. It was the law.
Perhaps, if you listen to his letter, you may feel a little softer towards him. He says that he feels quite badly about his position. He does not wish to hurt the security of your daughters. He hopes to make up for it in any possible way.
But how can he make up for it? Asked Jane. Yes, how indeed, said Mrs. Bennet. And you've invited him for 2 weeks?
No, he invited himself, my dear.
La, he sounds like an awfully boring person, said Lydia. Mr. Bennet regarded her coldly.
I guess you are disappointed. Maybe you would be happier if he wore a military coat. We are expecting this peaceful gentleman at 4 o'clock. Until then, please do not discuss what romantic or financial opportunity he has.
Mrs. Bennet was the person in the house when Mr. Collins arrived, exactly at 4 o'clock. He was a tall, heavy young man, about 25 years old. His manners were very formal, and he seemed very serious. You are on time, Mr. Collins, she said coldly. Will you have a seat, sir?
Thank you, ma'am.
And Mr. Collins sat. I hope, said Mrs. Bennet, that your journey was comfortable.
To tell you the truth, I hardly noticed the journey because my mind was too busy thinking about my arrival here. To speak directly, ma'am, I greatly hope to meet your 5 daughters. I have heard much of their beauty.
They are known to be the most handsome girls in the country. It is not surprising, after all. I have had my share of beauty.
You still do, if I may say so,
replied Mr. Collins, as he was a gentleman.
I have no doubt that soon all your daughters will be looking for a husband to marry.
I strongly hope they find a husband, or no one will be here to care for them. Matters such as property and wealth must be considered. Mr. Collins moved uneasily on his chair.
You are speaking about the fact that I will receive this property.
I do indeed, said Mrs. Bennet. She gave a heavy sigh. It's not that I find fault with you.
I care very much, ma'am, about the problems my position gives to my dear cousins. I could say much about this, but I do not wish to be too rude.
Please speak honestly with me, sir, said Mrs. Bennet hastily.
"You are very kind, ma'am. I will be honest with you. I must first tell you that I am very fortunate because a very important person, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, has taken me under her care. Her goodness has supported me throughout my life. Lady Catherine has advised me to marry."
Mrs. Bennet smiled and nodded her head wisely. "How very, very wise," she said.
"I am happy, ma'am, to see that you are so understanding. Now I can tell you that I have come here to find a wife."
"I am sure, sir, that marriage would add to your happiness."
"In truth, ma'am,"
said Mr. Collins, very serious,
"I mean to choose one of your daughters. It is my plan. Then one of your daughters will be able to keep her family property and father's house."
Mrs. Bennet stood up and stretched out both her hands to welcome him. "My dear Mr. Collins," she said, "I am most happy to welcome you to Longbourn." Chapter 4. A Young Man Wronged. Mr. Collins did not change his plan after he saw the 5 Bennet daughters. Jane's lovely face proved to him that his idea had been a good idea. From the first evening of his stay, she became his settled choice. The next morning before breakfast, however, Mrs. Bennet told him to be cautious about making Jane as his wife. She told Mr. Collins that Jane already had another wealthy man who was interested in marrying her. Mr. Collins then decided to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and this was soon done. Mrs. Bennet was hopeful that soon she would have 2 married daughters. After breakfast, all the Bennet girls decided to walk into Meryton. Mr. Collins was asked to join them, at the request of Mr. Bennet. He wanted to get rid of Mr. Collins so that he could have his library to himself. Earlier, Mr. Collins had followed him into the library and talked without stopping about his house and garden at Hunsford. Though prepared to put up with foolishness and pride in every other room, Mr. Bennet did not stand for such behavior in his library. Mr. Collins' speech was very proud all the way to Meryton. When they reached Meryton, the attention of the sisters was drawn away from him. There was a young man whom they had never seen, walking with an officer on the other side of the road. The officer was Mr. Denny. They knew him well. Kitty and Lydia, pretending to want something from a nearby shop, crossed the street. They had just reached the other side of the road when the 2 gentlemen reached the same spot. Mr. Denny asked permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham. Mr. Wickham had just decided to join the military as an army soldier. The sisters expressed their view that Mr. Wickham would be most charming if he were to dress in uniform. The party was talking together very nicely when they heard the sound of horses. Darcy and Bingley were riding down the street towards them. Bingley was looking at Jane, but Mr. Darcy decided not to look at Elizabeth. They were suddenly surprised by the sight of Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth noticed that both Mr. Darcy's and Mr. Bingley's faces changed colour. One looked white, the other red. After a few moments, Mr. Wickham touched his hat. Mr. Darcy had no choice but to return his greeting. Then Mr. Bingley rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips's house. Then they said their goodbyes. Mrs. Phillips, always glad to see her nieces, received Mr. Collins most politely. Some of the officers were going to dine the next day with the Phillipses. Their aunt promised to invite Mr. Wickham as well. As they were walking home to Longbourn, Elizabeth told Jane what she had seen. She wondered why Mr. Wickham had caused such surprise, but Jane had no explanation for this behavior. The coach took Mr. Collins and his 5 cousins to Meryton. When they arrived, the girls were delighted to hear that Mr. Wickham had also accepted their uncle's invitation. When Mr. Wickham entered the house, Elizabeth was struck by his handsomeness. He sat beside her, and after a while he asked, in an uncomfortable way, how long Mr. Darcy had been in town. "About a month," said Elizabeth. "I understand he has a very large property in Derbyshire."
"Yes,"
replied Wickham.
"I have known his family since my childhood."
Elizabeth looked surprised.
"I guess you are surprised, Miss Bennet. We did greet each other very coldly yesterday. To tell you the truth, I do not think of him as my friend."
"He can be a very disagreeable man," said Elizabeth.
"His father was a very good man, and the truest friend I ever had. You see, I should have been working for the church. If this had happened, I would now have a very good and valuable way of living. However, Mr. Darcy made my good fortune impossible to happen."
"Indeed?"
"Yes, his father wanted me to have his property and wealth. He was my godfather, and wanted to provide well for me. But after his death, his property was given elsewhere."
"Good heavens!" cried Elizabeth. "Why wasn't his will followed?"
"A certain part of the will was very unclear, or at least Mr. Darcy chose to make it unclear. The property was given to someone else. We are very different sort of men, me and Mr. Darcy, and he hates me."
"He deserves to be publicly punished."
"He will be, but not by me, because I remember the kindness of his father. I will never do something to hurt his family."
"But why did he behave so cruelly?" she asked.
"Jealousy,"
replied Mr. Wickham.
"My father was a lawyer. He did much to be useful to the late Mr. Darcy. He gave all his time and effort for taking care of the Pemberley property. He was also Mr. Darcy's closest friend. Before my father died, Mr. Darcy promised him he would provide for me, but his son's jealousy stopped him from doing so."
"Even though I have never liked him, I never thought Mr. Darcy would be as bad as this. How can Mr. Bingley be friends with him? He must not be aware of what Mr. Darcy has done."
"Probably he is not. Mr. Darcy can be a very nice friend if he thinks it is good for him. I know he takes care of his sister very carefully."
"What kind of a girl is Miss Darcy?"
"She's very, very proud, just like her brother. She is 16 years old. Since her father's death, she has lived in London. A lady takes care of her education."
Mr. Wickham's attention was then caught by Mr. Collins, who was talking about Lady Catherine de Bourgh, whose care he was under. He asked Elizabeth whether Mr. Collins was a close friend of the de Bourgh family. "I do not know how Mr. Collins was introduced to her," she replied, "but he has not known her for long."
Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters. Lady Catherine is aunt to the present Mr. Darcy.
They continued talking together until supper. On her way home, Elizabeth could only think of Mr. Wickham and what he had told her. Chapter 5. A Young Lady Ashamed. Elizabeth told Jane the next day about the conversation she had with Mr. Wickham. Jane was very surprised and concerned. "Good heavens!" she shouted. "Why would he behave so cruelly?" Elizabeth shrugged. "I imagine he was jealous." "How terrible! I did not think that Mr. Darcy was this bad." "Why is Bingley such good friends with him?" "He must not know what kind of man Mr. Darcy is," Jane replied. Then Elizabeth added, thoughtfully, "Mr. Darcy can be very pleasant when he chooses." Jane smiled. "He really wants to be pleasant to you, Lizzie." I have seen the way he looks at you." "Oh, no, Jane," said Elizabeth quickly. "You are mistaken, quite mistaken." At this point, Mr. Bingley arrived with his 2 sisters. They had come to invite the sisters to a dance at Netherfield, set for the following Tuesday. The idea of going to a dance excited everyone. Mrs. Bennet considered the invitation to be because of her eldest daughter's popularity. Jane could see herself spending a happy evening with her friends. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was looking forward to dancing a lot with Mr. Wickham. Kitty and Lydia thought Mr. Bingley would invite many officers and soldiers of the army. Even Mary seemed willing to attend. Elizabeth was so happy that she asked Mr. Collins if he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, and if he did, if he would think it proper to join in the evening's entertainment.
"Of course I do,"
he replied.
"I hope to be honored by being able to dance with all my fair cousins, and I take this opportunity to ask you, Miss Elizabeth, for the first 2 dances."
Elizabeth was secretly hoping to be able to spend time with Mr. Wickham during the dance, but she accepted Mr. Collins' invitation as politely as she could. After talking with Mr. Collins, it became clear to her that she was Mr. Collins' choice for a future wife. Soon, Elizabeth's mother kept talking about how agreeable a future marriage between them would be. Elizabeth decided to say nothing. Mr. Collins might never make such an offer, and, until he did, there was no point in arguing about it. On the night of the dance, there was no doubt in Elizabeth's mind that Mr. Wickham would not attend. She looked unsuccessfully for him among the army men that were there. She was quite disappointed, and had even paid more attention to her dress than usual. She had prepared in the highest spirits to win his heart. His friend, Mr. Denny, whom Lydia had already attached herself to, told her that Mr. Wickham had to go to town the day before to take care of business.
"I'm sure he would have left his business for a while,"
he added with a knowing smile,
"if there wasn't a certain gentleman here tonight."
Elizabeth believed that Mr. Darcy had told Bingley not to give Wickham an invitation, but Elizabeth's character did not hold ill feeling for long. After having told her problem to Charlotte Lucas, she felt much better. However, the first 2 dances were not very enjoyable. Mr. Collins was not a very good dancer and would often make wrong moves. He was a very disagreeable partner. She danced the next dance with an officer and then stopped to talk to Charlotte. Suddenly, Mr. Darcy appeared and asked her to dance. This took her so much by surprise that she accepted. Charlotte tried to make her feel better. "Don't worry, I'm sure you will find him very agreeable." "Heavens, no. I am determined to hate him. Do not wish me such an evil thing." The dancing began again, and Darcy came to take Elizabeth's hand. They took their places in the dance set. They stood for a while without speaking to each other. She said something unimportant, and he replied. Then they were both silent again. "It is your turn to say something to me now, Mr. Darcy," she told him. "I've already talked about the dance, and you should make some remark about the size of the room or the number of couples." He smiled and asked her if she and her sisters often walked to Meryton. "Yes," she replied, and was not able to stop from asking the question that had been burning her for days. She added, "When we met you on the way there the other day, we had just made a new friend, a Mr. Wickham, from Pemberley in Derbyshire. He says that you know him." Mr. Darcy's body immediately became tight.
"I would like to forget that Mr. Wickham and we were once friends,"
he said coldly. But is that fair, Mr. Darcy? Can you not forgive Mr. Wickham, even if he has made you angry or done something to harm you?
I am not the type of person to forgive so easily. My hatred, once created, does not go away.
You are certain that, in this case, it has been created?
Most certainly, Miss Bennet,
replied Darcy strongly. And you do not think you can be blinded by feelings, whether your feelings are right or not?
I hope this is not true.
If you don't change how you feel about something or someone, then you have to judge correctly the first time you meet someone. Mr. Darcy noted her words and asked,
Why are you asking me these questions?
So that I can know what type of character you have, replied Elizabeth. I am trying to figure you out.
And do you find my character agreeable?
She shook her head. I do not agree with your character or manners at all.
I hope, Miss Bennet,
he replied seriously,
that you not try to understand my character at this present moment. I am afraid that you will come to a misunderstanding.
She said no more. They finished the dance and left one another in silence. Miss Bingley came towards her. So, Miss Elizabeth, your sister tells me that you are quite interested in George Wickham. I'm sure he has told you that he was the son of old Wickham, the late Mr. Darcy's personal servant. Before you find him too delightful, let me advise you not to believe what he says. He often tells many lies. As to Mr. Darcy doing wrong to him, it is not true. He was always kind to him, though Wickham treated him badly many times. Now, I do not know everything that happened, but I know that Mr. Darcy isn't the one to blame. The fact that Wickham is again in the countryside is very rude, but this is expected if you consider his family background. From our words, I gather that he is guilty, because of his background, said Elizabeth angrily. You accuse him of being the son of Mr. Darcy's steward. To let you know, Mr. Wickham has already told me this himself. I beg your pardon, replied Miss Bingley, turning away. Excuse my interpretation. I meant it kindly and was not trying to be rude. Mean-hearted girl, thought Elizabeth to herself. You can never influence me by something as unimportant as someone's background. The rest of the evening gave Elizabeth little amusement or happiness. Mr. Collins kept bothering her by keeping to her side. He was not able to get another dance with her again, but he stopped others from dancing with her too. She owed Charlotte Lucas a lot of thanks, who often joined them and made conversation with Mr. Collins. This gave some relief to Elizabeth. Elizabeth kept her attention on her sister and Mr. Bingley. She did not doubt the gentleman's high respect and deep feeling for Jane. But Mr. Collins was not her only source of worry. When they sat down to supper, Elizabeth was quite ashamed to hear her mother speaking openly to Lady Lucas about her wish that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley. Her mother pointed out the good advantages of such a match. Mr. Bingley was so charming and rich. This was also promising for her younger daughters. Jane's marriage to a man of such good fortune as Mr. Bingley would make her other daughters more attractive too. Elizabeth unsuccessfully tried to stop her mother from saying so much. She tried to get her to speak more quietly. She could see, to her shame and horror, that Mr. Darcy could hear what her mother was saying. However, her mother only scolded her. Why should I be afraid of Mr. Darcy? Must I say nothing that may offend him? For heaven's sake, Mamma, please speak quieter. What advantage do you have in offending Mr. Darcy? You know that he is Bingley's friend, and you cannot recommend yourself by so doing. Nothing she could say was of any help. Elizabeth turned red with shame and embarrassment. She could not help looking at Mr. Darcy. Soon she saw that the expression on his face became very serious. Her worst fears had come true. Even when supper was finished, Elizabeth could only relax for a short time. The company wanted to sing, and she had the embarrassment of seeing Mary prepare to sing for everybody. Mary's voice was very weak, and her manner not true. Elizabeth was truly suffering. Above all, Lydia and Kitty were behaving without shame by flirting with all the officers. She felt that her entire family, except for Jane, were showing themselves in a poor light. They could not have tried to act worse than they were doing now. When they were finally preparing to leave, Mrs. Bennet invited Mr. Bingley to join them for dinner at any time, even without an invitation. She told him that this would make her very happy. Bingley thanked her and promised that he would take the opportunity to do so as soon as possible. Mrs. Bennet left with the delightful idea that she would soon see Jane married and settled at Netherfield in a few months. She also thought, but not with equal delight, that she would very soon have another daughter married to Mr. Collins. Chapter 6. A Young Man Refused. 2 days later, Mr. Collins asked Elizabeth to be his wife. He was very orderly in his manner. One day, after breakfast, when he found Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, and Kitty together, he addressed the mother.
"May I hope, madam, for your approval when I ask to privately speak with your fair daughter, Elizabeth?"
Elizabeth turned red with surprise, but before she could say anything, Mrs. Bennet was already leading Kitty to the door. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "I am sure Lizzie will be very happy to speak with you. Come, Kitty, I want you upstairs." She was hurrying away with Kitty when Elizabeth called out, "Dear mother, please do not go. I beg you to stay. Anything Mr. Collins has to say can be heard by you. He has no need to speak to me alone. I will leave with Kitty." No, don't be silly, Lizzie. You stay where you are. I insist that you listen to what Mr. Collins has to say." After thinking for a moment, Elizabeth thought it would be wisest to get it over as quickly and as quietly as possible. She sat down again on the sofa, took up her sewing, and Mr. Collins began.
"Believe me, my dear Miss Elizabeth, your lack of selfishness only adds to your other perfections. You can hardly doubt, I know, the reason why I want to speak to you. It's true, my attentions toward you have been too strong to be mistaken. But before I talk about my feelings, perhaps it will be better for me to explain my reasons for wanting to marry you."
The idea that Mr. Collins was weak against his feelings made Elizabeth almost laugh. She was not able to stop him from speaking further.
"First, I think it is a good example for a man of the church to marry. Secondly, I am convinced our marriage will add to my happiness. Thirdly, a very noble lady whom I'm very grateful toward wishes me to marry."
"Your reasons, sir, are clever and well thought out," said Elizabeth hurriedly. "But I think you would be—" Mr. Collins held up his hand. No, please do not speak. I have not finished yet. I have another reason. Because I am going to get this property after the death of your father, I have decided to marry one of his daughters. This way, you and your sisters will not lose very much. This is my main reason." "Your reason, sir, is very kind and respectable, but—"
I am glad that you approve of my ideas. Now, I have only to convince you of how strong my feelings for you are. I repeat, dear cousin, the strength of my feelings for you."
It was absolutely necessary for Elizabeth to interrupt him now. "You are too quick, sir," she answered. "Though I am able to see the honor and necessity of your offer, I cannot accept it."
"I know, dear cousin,"
replied Mr. Collins.
"it is common for young ladies not to accept a man's wishes. Sometimes their refusal is repeated a second or a third time."
"Upon my word, sir," cried Elizabeth, "I am not speaking in such a way."
"Please believe me, dear cousin, that your refusal does not discourage me."
"Your hope is quite amazing after what I have just told you," interrupted Elizabeth. "I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You cannot make me happy. I am the last woman in the world who could make you happy. I'm certain that your friend, Lady Catherine, if she knew me, would not consider me suitable for the situation."
"I do not think Lady Catherine would disapprove of you,"
said Mr. Collins very seriously.
"She said, 'Choose a gentlewoman and let her be both active and useful. Make sure she has been raised not to expect too much, so that she can make a small amount of money go a long way.'"
"You give me too much praise, sir."
"When I see Lady Catherine,"
continued Mr. Collins,
"I shall speak about you in the highest terms."
"Really, Mr. Collins," cried Elizabeth with some warmth, "you confuse me. I have said nothing to you that can be taken as an encouragement. I don't know how to express my refusal any more strongly."
"Come now, dear cousin, I know that your refusal is merely words. My offer is very worthy, and you can only accept it. No, you wish to make me love you more by not giving yourself to me too easily. This is common with traditional women of good manners."
Elizabeth was becoming desperate. "Truthfully, I say to you, sir, I have no future plans to marry you. I thank you for the honor, but my feelings cannot allow me to accept your offer. Can I speak any plainer?"
"Oh, you are so charming,"
he cried.
"I am sure that when your father has given his approval, the matter may be considered settled."
Elizabeth stood up and moved towards the door. Then she stopped and said, "Really, Mr. Collins, you might do me the honor of believing what I say. Then, indeed, this matter would be settled." She closed the door behind her. Mrs. Bennet was waiting in the hall for the end of the meeting. She saw Elizabeth walk quickly towards the stairs. Then she went in to Mr. Collins, smiling warmly. "So it is settled," she cried. "May I be the first to congratulate you, my dear Mr. Collins?"
"Thank you, dear ma'am,"
he replied, and gave her a little bow.
"I have every reason to be happy with my dear cousin's refusal."
"Refusal?" cried Mrs. Bennet, shocked.
"Yes, indeed, ma'am,"
said Mr. Collins happily.
"She told me that she would not have me. I'm sure she means to encourage me."
"Mr. Collins, if only this were true! But that is not Lizzie's manner. She must have meant what she said." Mr. Collins looked surprised.
"Is it possible that she would refuse me?"
"Please forgive her, Mr. Collins, but she is a very foolish girl and has too strong of a will. She does not know about her own interests. But don't worry, she will be made to be reasonable. She shall be made to—"
"Pardon me for interrupting you, madam,"
said Mr. Collins.
"but if it's true that she is really too willful and foolish, she will not be a suitable wife for me. You must consider my situation."
"Sir, you misunderstand me," said Mrs. Bennet, worried. "She is as good-natured a girl as ever lived. It's only in these matters that she can be willful. I will speak directly to Mr. Bennet. We shall very soon settle it with her, I am sure." Not giving him time to reply, she hurriedly went to her husband in the library. "Oh, Mr. Bennet, You must make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins. She says she will not marry him. If you do not hurry, he will not have her."
"I'm afraid I do not understand what you are talking about,"
said Mr. Bennet calmly.
"Whom are you talking about?"
"Mr. Collins and Lizzie, of course. Lizzie says she will not have Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins is now beginning to say that he will not have Lizzie."
"What do you want me to do? It seems hopeless."
"Tell Lizzie that you command her to marry him."
"Call her in. I'll tell her my opinion."
Mrs. Bennet rang the bell, and Miss Elizabeth was called into the library.
"Come here, child,"
said her father.
"I hear from your mother that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage."
"Yes, Papa."
"And have you refused this offer?"
"I have, sir."
"Well, your mother insists that you accept this offer. Is this not so, Mrs. Bennet?"
"Yes, or I will never see her again."
"You have an unhappy choice, Elizabeth. From this day on, you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will not see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will not see you again if you do."
"Mr. Bennet!" cried his wife very angrily. "Oh, thank you, Papa," cried Elizabeth. Then she gave him a very loving hug and left. "Why, Mr. Bennet, did you talk in that way? You must insist that she marry him."
"I have 2 small favors to ask of you, my dear,"
replied her husband.
"First, please allow me to have my own judgment. And secondly, let me use my room as I please. Right now, I'd be most happy if you let me have the library to myself."
Mrs. Bennet left the library, but she did not give up on Mr. Collins' offer. She talked to Elizabeth again and again, hoping to make her change her mind. While the family were in this confusion, Charlotte Lucas came to visit. Immediately, Mrs. Bennet asked her to help convince Lizzie to listen to the wishes of her family. "Please speak to her, dear Charlotte," she added sadly. "Nobody is on my side, and nobody takes my part." Just then, Kitty and Lydia came into the room. "Oh, Mamma, what is going to happen to us?" cried Lydia. "What are we to do?" screamed Kitty. "Good heavens!" cried Mrs. Bennet. "Don't shout like this, girls. My head is ready to blow open." "But, Mamma," cried Lydia, "our officers are leaving. They have been ordered to go next week to Brighton. Oh, Mamma, what is to become of us?" "My heart will break," screamed Kitty. Mrs. Bennet put her hands to her head. "This is too much for me." Just then the door opened. It was the maid, carrying a letter. "A letter, ma'am," the maid told Mrs. Bennet, "for Miss Jane. One of the men from Netherfield has just left it." "For me?" said Jane, embarrassed. She took the letter and walked towards the window. "It must be from Bingley," Mrs. Bennet whispered to Charlotte. She watched hungrily while Jane opened the envelope and began to read the letter. Elizabeth saw her sister's face change as she read the letter. "Well, what does he say?" cried Mrs. Bennet. "Thank heavens there is still Mr. Bingley for us." "The letter, Mamma, is from Miss Caroline Bingley," answered Jane sadly. "Why, what is it, my love?" said Mrs. Bennet, coming toward her. "You've gone all white." I am surprised by this news, Mamma. The whole family has left Netherfield. They are on their way to Mr. Darcy's house in town. They will not return this winter." "This is Mr. Darcy's doing," said Elizabeth. "Oh, my poor Jane!" cried Mrs. Bennet. "You have lost him forever." Jane quickly hurried from the room. "And my poor Kitty and Lydia," continued their mother. "You are soon to lose your officers, my poor daughters." Mrs. Bennet sat down onto the sofa, her hands raised to her head. Chapter 7. An Engagement for a Young Lady. Together with all the problems and troubles, it seemed that Mr. Collins's offer was no longer good either. In a short talk with Mrs. Bennet, he told her that he had decided to end his feelings of favour toward her daughter. He added that he had sadly come to the decision that Elizabeth would not make a good wife for him. He started to give his attentions to Charlotte Lucas. Her nice manners in listening to his complaints were a relief for them all. Elizabeth had hoped that her refusal would make him leave sooner than planned, but he had asked to stay a fortnight, and a fortnight he would stay. On the following day, the Bennets dined with the Lucases. Once again, Charlotte was very kind and gave most of her time to Mr. Collins. This was most friendly, but Charlotte's kindness was for another reason that Elizabeth had not yet guessed. Charlotte's purpose was to move Mr. Collins's attentions away from Elizabeth and then have them for herself. This was Miss Lucas's plan. Things continued so smoothly between them that she felt almost sure of success. One morning before Mr. Collins was to leave for Hertfordshire, Miss Lucas saw him from an upper window as he walked towards the house. She immediately left to meet him, as if accidentally, in the lane. Soon, despite Mr. Collins's long way of speaking, everything was settled between them. Sir William and Lady Lucas, the parents of Charlotte, joyfully gave their permission. They thought it a very lucky match for their daughter, as they had little fortune to give her. But Charlotte was worried that it would bring unhappiness to Elizabeth Bennet. She valued their friendship beyond that of any other person. After Mr. Collins returned, he made ready to leave the Bennet house. Because he was beginning his journey early the next morning, he said goodbye to the ladies that night. Mrs. Bennet told him they would be happy to see him at Longbourn again.
"My dear madam,"
he replied,
"I have been hoping for this invitation. You may be quite certain that I shall take this opportunity as soon as possible."
The ladies were all very surprised that he would even be thinking about a quick return. On the following morning, however, his reason became quite clear. Charlotte Lucas called, and in a private talk with Elizabeth, told her about the events of the day before. Elizabeth's surprise was very great. She could not help crying out, "Dear Charlotte, it's impossible!" Charlotte was a little hurt at this, but calmly said, "Why are you so surprised? Do you think it impossible that Mr. Collins succeed with me because he failed with you?" "No, I did not mean that at all," said Elizabeth quickly. "My dear, I am so very happy that you will be my cousin after you marry. I wish you all the happiness in the world." "You know that I am not romantic in manner," replied Charlotte. "I only want a comfortable home, and I am sure that my chance of happiness with him is fair in this way. I am sure it is the same chance as most people can say when they decide to get married." Elizabeth quietly answered, "Undoubtedly." Later in the day, Sir William Lucas, Charlotte's father, appeared. He had come to announce his daughter's future marriage to the Bennets. Mrs. Bennet replied that he must be mistaken. Lydia, whose character often made her speak too much, loudly said, "Good Lord! How can you say such a thing, Sir William? Don't you know that Mr. Collins wants to marry Elizabeth?" Sir William had good manners, so he only smiled politely. Then Elizabeth told them that she had earlier spoken to Charlotte about the matter. Her mother and younger sisters were rudely asking questions, but Elizabeth started to loudly congratulate Sir William. Jane readily joined her and offered her congratulations too. When Sir William left, Mrs. Bennet let out her true feelings. She believed the Lucases had tricked Mr. Collins away from Elizabeth. It was a month before she would speak to Sir William or Lady Lucas without being rude, and many months before she decided to forgive their daughter. Lady Lucas was full of happiness to have her daughter so well married. She often called at Longbourn to say how happy she was, though Mrs. Bennet's mean looks were strong enough to drive any happiness away. Mr. Collins wrote to them about his good fortune. He then added his decision to return to Longbourn on Monday in 2 weeks so as to enjoy Miss Lucas's company. Lady Catherine, he said, truly approved of his marriage, and she wished it to take place as soon as possible. Meanwhile, there was no further news from Mr. Bingley. Jane had replied to Caroline's letter, and she was counting the days to hear some news again. Elizabeth began to worry that Mr. Bingley's 2 uncaring sisters and Mr. Darcy were keeping Mr. Bingley from Jane. She also worried that the amusements and entertainment of London would be too much for the strength of Bingley's attachment to Jane. In the meantime, Mrs. Bennet never stopped speaking about Mr. Bingley and how impatient she was for his return. She even managed to convince Jane that she had been badly treated by him. Mr. Collins returned to Longbourn, which also bothered Mrs. Bennet. She was not quite as polite or positive as she had been on his first visit. However, he was often calling on Charlotte, which relieved the Bennets of dealing with his company. Mrs. Bennet was really in a most horrible and sad state. Even speaking about the future wedding put her into a bad mood. The sight of Miss Lucas was too much for her. She came to believe that Mr. Collins and Charlotte were planning to make her and her daughters leave the house immediately after Mr. Bennet's death. Finally, a letter from Miss Bingley arrived. The beginning part stated their decision to stay in London for the winter. The ending expressed her brother's sadness at not being able to say goodbye to his friends before he left. Miss Bingley also stated that Mr. Bingley had not much free time. He had been introduced to Mr. Darcy's fine-looking younger sister, Georgiana, and had been so attracted to her that he could think of nothing else. This made Elizabeth very angry. She knew that Bingley was fond of Jane, but she also knew that he was under the control of his wicked friend, Mr. Darcy. She began to think that Mr. Bingley had a very weak character. Elizabeth blamed Darcy for taking Bingley away from Jane. She knew that Mr. Darcy hated her family and thought that he was rescuing his friend. Chapter 8. A Clergyman at Home. Mr. Collins spent a week making plans of marriage and love. Then he returned to his house at Hunsford in Kent to prepare the house to welcome his bride. Their wedding day had been fixed. The following Monday, Mrs. Bennet received her brother and his wife. They had come from London to spend Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a gentle man, quite above his sister in nature as well as in education. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet, was an intelligent and well-mannered woman. She was a great favourite with all her nieces. Between Jane and Elizabeth and her, there was a very strong regard. Mrs. Gardiner began their visit by giving out her presents. Then she began to describe the newest fashions in London. Soon, Mrs. Bennet began to tell her of her problems. She explained that they had been wronged since she last saw her sister. 2 of her girls had been on the point of marriage, and both plans had fallen through. "I do not blame Jane for being disappointed," Mrs. Bennet said. "But Lizzie, oh, sister, I don't agree that she should not be Mr. Collins's wife. I'm quite sad that she refused him. Now Lady Lucas's daughter will be married before I have any of my daughters married. Also, the future of our property is still in danger. However, I'm glad that you have come. It is a great comfort to me." Mrs. Gardiner already knew of the situation from Jane and Elizabeth's letters to her. She gave her sister a quiet answer and decided to turn the conversation to other things. When she was afterwards alone with Elizabeth, she said, "It seems that Jane would have had a very good match. I am sorry that it went wrong. Maybe we can convince her to go back to London with us. A change of place might do her a world of good." Elizabeth was quite pleased with this idea, and Jane happily accepted her aunt's invitation. No sooner had the Gardiners left with Jane than Mr. Collins returned. But he decided to stay with the Lucases. The wedding day was set for Thursday, and on Wednesday Miss Lucas came for her goodbye visit. When she stood up to go, Elizabeth accompanied her out of the room. "Promise me you will come and see me at Hunsford," Charlotte asked. "My father and sister are coming in March. Will you think about joining them?" Elizabeth could not refuse, though she did not see much pleasure in the visit. The wedding took place as planned. Then the couple set off for Kent from the church door. Elizabeth soon received a letter from her friend. Charlotte was living comfortably. She liked the furniture, the house, and neighborhood very much, and Lady Catherine's behavior was most friendly. Jane had also written to say that she had arrived safely in London. She had also written to Miss Caroline Bingley to tell her that she was there. 4 weeks passed, and Jane wrote that she still had seen nothing of Mr. Bingley or his sister. After 2 more weeks, Miss Bingley finally appeared. But it was clear that she did not even want to make the visit. She apologized for not calling before, but she did not say that she wished to see Jane again. She said that her brother knew that Jane was in town, but he was so very busy with Mr. Darcy that they hardly ever saw him. Then she added that it was not likely that Mr. Darcy would ever return to Netherfield. He planned to give up the house he had rented there. This letter hurt Elizabeth, but she felt better knowing that Jane would no longer be fooled by Caroline, at least. As for Bingley, she decided that since his character was so weak, it was best for Jane not to see him any more. In March, Elizabeth was set to accompany Sir William and his second daughter, Maria, to Hunsford. She began to look forward to the journey. She would be able to see Jane, as she was going to spend a night at the gardener's house in Gracechurch Street in London. The journey to London was only 24 miles, and they began early so as to arrive by noon. Elizabeth was pleased to see that Jane was looking as healthy and lovely as ever. The day passed most pleasantly. The afternoon was spent shopping and the evening at the theatre. Later that night, Elizabeth's uncle and aunt invited her to accompany them to the Lake District in the summer. She readily and gratefully accepted. The next day, when they left the main road for the road to Hunsford, they came upon the home of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. The church's house also soon came into sight. The house had green windows and rows of bushes along the garden. Mr. Collins and Charlotte appeared at the door. Soon they were all out in the garden, celebrating the sight of one another. Mrs. Collins welcomed Elizabeth warmly, and Elizabeth was glad at having come. She noted immediately that her cousin's manners were not changed, even after his marriage. When he talked about the good build of his house, all its history and its furniture, she felt that he spoke particularly to her. It appeared that he wished to make her feel she had lost much in refusing his offer. She wondered how it was possible that her friend could be so cheerful with such a proud husband. Mr. Collins proudly pointed to Rosings, a house near Hunsford. He told them they were very lucky to have an invitation to dine there the next day. Mr. Collins spent the whole day talking about their planned visit to Rosings. He instructed them about what to expect so that they would not be frightened by the richness of so many rooms, so many servants, and so wonderful a dinner. While they were dressing, he came 2 or 3 times to their different doors to tell them to hurry and be on time. He explained that Lady Catherine did not like to have to wait for her dinner. Mr. Collins' stories frightened poor little Maria Lucas and made her feel quite nervous. As the weather was fine, they had a nice and pleasant walk across the park. But when they started to walk up the steps to Rosings, only Elizabeth was able to be unafraid. They were met at the entrance hall by a servant, and he led them to the room where Lady Catherine was sitting. Her ladyship proudly stood up to receive them. Sir William bowed very low and sat down without saying a word. His daughter, Maria, was terribly frightened and sat on the edge of her chair, not knowing which way to look. Elizabeth found herself quite prepared for the dinner. Lady Catherine was a tall, large woman with strong features. She was very serious and harsh. Her manner of receiving her visitors seemed for the purpose of making her guests remember their low position in society when compared to hers. She spoke so powerfully that it showed her self-importance. The dinner was set very beautifully, and there were all the servants and all the variety of dishes that Mr. Collins had talked about. He took his seat at the bottom of the table, as Lady Catherine wished for him to do. He looked as if life could not be anything greater. He praised every dish he ate, and Sir William repeated everything his son-in-law said. Elizabeth began to wonder how Lady Catherine could bear Mr. Collins's manner. But Lady Catherine seemed grateful for their strong praise, and she replied by giving warm smiles. When the ladies left for the living-room, Lady Catherine talked without any break until the coffee arrived. She asked Elizabeth a variety of questions, as she knew little about her. She asked how many sisters she had, whether any of them were married, whether they were beautiful, what carriage her father kept, and what had been her mother's unmarried name. Elizabeth felt that these questions were very rude, but she answered them politely. When the time came for them to leave, Mrs. Collins was offered a horse carriage. She gratefully accepted it. With many words of thanks and with many bows from Sir William, they left. Chapter 9. A Young Lady Cries. Sir William and Maria stayed for only a week at Hunsford. After they left, Elizabeth was able to spend her time quite comfortably. She dined at Rosings about twice a week, but other meetings and dinners for her were few. Still, the weather was fine, and Elizabeth greatly enjoyed being out of doors. Her favorite walk was along an open road that was beside the park. Soon it was to be Easter. Elizabeth heard that two of Lady Catherine's nephews, Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam, were expected to be at Rosings. Mr. Darcy was highly spoken of by Lady Catherine, and she seemed almost angry when she found out that Elizabeth had already met him before. When these two gentlemen arrived, Mr. Collins went to Rosings to greet them. On his return, the two gentlemen decided to accompany him. This surprised Charlotte. She saw them from the window and ran to tell Elizabeth. "I must thank you, Elizabeth, for being here," she said. "Mr. Darcy would probably never have come to visit me." Colonel Fitzwilliam was a most true gentleman in character. He was about 30 years of age and was not particularly handsome. Mr. Darcy looked the same and greeted Elizabeth calmly. She bowed to him without saying a word. Colonel Fitzwilliam talked easily, like a well-mannered and educated man, but Mr. Darcy sat for some time without speaking. After a while, he asked Elizabeth about how her family was doing. She answered him that they were quite well, and after waiting a moment, she added, "My eldest sister, Jane, has been in town these past 3 months. Have you neither heard from nor seen her there?" Mr. Darcy looked a little confused by what she had said. Then he answered that he had not the luck of meeting Miss Bennet in town. They did not speak further about the subject. Colonel Fitzwilliam's manners were both respected and enjoyed, and the ladies felt it would be very pleasurable to have him there at their visits at Rosings. However, they did not receive an invitation until Easter Day. Colonel Fitzwilliam had called at the Collins house more than once during the time, but Mr. Darcy they had only seen at church. Her ladyship received the family very coolly. It was easy to know that their company was most welcomed only when she could not receive anybody else. Colonel Fitzwilliam seemed really glad to see them. His attention was very caught by Elizabeth. He entertained her so well by talking about many subjects: Kent and Hertfordshire, travelling, new books, and music. Elizabeth was grateful for his company. The Colonel then asked Elizabeth to play the piano for him. He led her to the piano, and he placed a chair near to her. Lady Catherine only listened to half a song, and then started talking to Darcy. Finally, Darcy walked away and stood by the piano to have a full view of Elizabeth's performance. When she had finished a song, Elizabeth said, "Do you mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by standing in such a serious manner to hear me? But I will not be scared."
"I'm sure you don't really believe that I want to scare you,"
replied Darcy, and he gave one of his unusual smiles.
"I have known you long enough to realize that you often greatly enjoy stating opinions that are in fact not your own."
Elizabeth did not get upset, but laughed instead. She decided to challenge Darcy's manner and said, "Perhaps it is not wise of you to speak of all that you know about me. Are you trying to put me at a disadvantage? It may make me speak of things about you that may shock your relations."
"Don't worry, I'm not afraid of you,"
he said smilingly.
"What do you have to say against him? Let's hear it,"
said Colonel Fitzwilliam. "I remember the first time I ever saw him. He was at a dance in our town, and what do you think he did? He only danced 4 dances the whole night, and there was more than one young lady without a partner. Mr. Darcy, you must say this is true."
"At that time I only knew my own party and did not have the honor of knowing any lady. Perhaps it would have been better if I had looked for an introduction. I am not good at speaking with those I have never met before." "That's because he will not give himself the trouble,"
said his cousin. Elizabeth decided to change the subject and said, "I'm afraid my fingers cannot move as cleverly as other women's do over this instrument, but then I do not practice as I should. I'm afraid it has been too long since I last played." Darcy smiled and said,
"You are quite right, but I also feel that neither of us likes to perform in front of strangers."
Elizabeth began to play again. Lady Catherine came near and said to Darcy, "Miss Bennet's playing would not have so many mistakes if she practiced more." Elizabeth looked at Darcy and could see that he was as amused as she was. Lady Catherine continued to speak to Darcy about her thoughts on Elizabeth's playing. However, the gentleman requested that Elizabeth continued to play all night. She did not stop until the carriage was ready to take them all home. The next morning, Elizabeth decided to write a letter to Jane, while Mr. and Mrs. Collins had left for the village. She was surprised by a ring at the door. She was even more surprised when she answered the door and saw that it was Mr. Darcy. He entered the room. He seemed equally surprised to find her alone. He was completely silent until Elizabeth asked, "Were Mr. Bingley and his sisters well when you left London?"
"In perfect health, I thank you."
"I understand that Mr. Bingley does not want to return to Netherfield again?"
"He may not spend very much of his time there in the future."
"If he means not to be there very often, then it would be better if he gave up the property completely. Then we might have a settled family there. It would be better for the neighborhood."
"I should not be very surprised,"
said Darcy.
if he gave it up as soon as he finds any other property of equal value that has become available.
Elizabeth did not answer. She decided to leave the trouble of finding something to talk about to him. He asked her,
"Are you pleased with Kent?"
They spoke for a short while on the subject of the country, but this was soon put to an end by the entrance of Charlotte. Mr. Darcy sat for a few minutes longer without saying very much. Then he excused himself and left. "What is the meaning of this?" said Charlotte. "My dear Elizabeth, I think he must be in love with you." Elizabeth told Charlotte this was probably not true. She replied that his visit was because it was too difficult to find anything else to do at that time of year. All field sports were finished for the year. At his house there was Lady Catherine, books, and a billiard table, but it was impossible for a gentleman to always be indoors. In the days that followed, it was indeed quite difficult to understand why Mr. Darcy came so often to the Collinses' house. He often sat without saying much to anyone. Charlotte wanted to believe that he came because he was in love with Elizabeth. She tried to watch him closely, but she had no success with guessing his reason. Elizabeth started to unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy on her walks through the park. The first time they met, so that it would not happen again, she told him that the park was her favorite place. But she met him again a second time, and she thought it was very strange. She even met him a third time. Every time they met, he never said a great deal. Still, Elizabeth began to feel an unexpected pleasure in his company. One day, as she was walking about the park and rereading Jane's last letter, she saw that Colonel Fitzwilliam was approaching.
"I have been making a walk about the park,"
he said.
"Are you going much farther?"
"No, I was planning on turning back home in a moment." They walked towards the house together. Elizabeth said, "I believe you know two ladies whom I also know, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley."
"I have met them before. Their brother is a great friend of Darcy's."
"Oh, yes," said Elizabeth coolly. "Mr. Darcy takes great care of him."
"Great care of him?" "Yes,"
replied the Colonel.
"I believe Bingley owes him very much."
"What do you mean, owes him?"
"Mr. Darcy told me that he had recently saved a close friend from unwisely getting married. I guessed that he was speaking about Bingley."
"Did Mr. Darcy tell you what his reasons were for his belief that it was an unwise marriage?"
"I understood that the lady was not of high character."
Elizabeth did not reply. She walked on, her heart quickly filling with anger. "Your cousin's way of handling problems sometimes troubles me," she said at last. "Why should he be the judge?"
"You think his involvement was not correct?"
"I do not see what right Mr. Darcy has that he can decide about his friend's happiness," she said. Later that night, in her own room, Elizabeth was able to think without being disturbed. She had never doubted that Darcy had been responsible for separating Bingley and Jane, but she had also always thought that Miss Bingley was the main person responsible. Now, after speaking to the Colonel, it became clear that Mr. Darcy was the cause. He had ruined all hope of happiness for Jane. About Jane, Elizabeth knew that he could not find fault with her. She also knew that nothing could be said against her father, as Mr. Darcy himself had praised her father's abilities. Then, however, she thought of her mother and sisters. Suddenly, her belief changed. She remembered how ashamed she had felt over their conduct at the Netherfield dance. This made her suddenly begin to cry. Soon, the tears gave her a headache. She did not want to see Mr. Darcy that night, so she decided not to go to Rosings that evening. Mrs. Collins did not try to change her mind, but Mr. Collins was very afraid that Lady Catherine would be unhappy and angry. Chapter 10. A Young Man Surprised. The house was very quiet. The Collinses had been gone a long time to Lady Catherine's, and Elizabeth was sleeping. Suddenly, she was awakened by the sound of the doorbell. She was quite amazed when the servant announced Mr. Darcy. In a hurried and nervous way, he began to ask about her health, saying that he had come to wish her better soon. She answered him politely, but was very cold. He remained sitting for a few moments, then got up and walked about the room. Suddenly he approached her in a very nervous manner.
"Miss Bennet, Elizabeth, I cannot fight something even though I have tried,"
he said.
"I am not strong enough. You must please allow me to tell you that I admire and love you."
Elizabeth's surprise was truly great. She stared at him and went red in the face, but she could not speak and was silent.
"Miss Bennet, I have tried to stop feeling this way about you. I have been raised since I was young to believe that I must marry someone of my own position and wealth. I'm sure you know that I am a proud man, Miss Bennet. You must understand that your relations trouble me greatly. Their condition in life is very much beneath my own. I came to London to forget you, but I cannot do this, and now it seems I have been made to return to you. Miss Bennet, please say you will marry me."
"No!" cried Elizabeth.
"No?"
repeated Darcy. Suddenly his face went white. "Are you surprised by my answer?" asked Elizabeth coldly. "Had you already decided that I would accept? Mr. Darcy, those feelings that you say you have for me are unacceptable."
"You don't believe me?"
he shouted, fixing his eyes on her face. "I have never wanted your good opinion of me," Elizabeth continued. "Also, you tell me that you do not even wish to have it, that you like me against your will."
"I ask you to think about—"
"I am most hurt and embarrassed by the way you speak about my relations."
"I did not mean to hurt you."
"Then you do not understand what it means to respect my feelings."
"Indeed,"
said Darcy, also hurt.
"I am most sorry if I have hurt you. I simply wish to tell you truthfully about my own feelings."
"While you completely forgot about my own. No, Mr. Darcy, I am sorry if I cause you pain."
"Is this your reply to my question?"
he interrupted. "Not all. I have other reasons to be upset by you. Do you think I would marry the man who has ruined the happiness of my sister?"
"It's true that I have done all I can to separate my friend from Miss Jane Bennet, but I wish to save him from an unhappy marriage. I believe I have been kinder towards him than myself."
"Have you indeed?" cried Elizabeth angrily. This made her red in the face, and she replied, "And is this the same kindness you gave to Mr. Wickham?"
"Wickham, you are too interested in that gentleman's concerns,"
said Darcy. His face became deeper in color. "He has told me of his troubles with you."
"His troubles?"
repeated Darcy hatefully.
"Oh, yes, his troubles have been very great indeed."
"How can you make fun of him? You have caused him to live his life like a poor man."
"This is what you think of me?"
cried Darcy.
"I thank you for explaining your thoughts so fully. I see now that my faults with you are heavy indeed. But perhaps,"
he added,
"you might have forgiven me these problems if I had not hurt your pride by my honesty concerning your family. Can I say nothing that will change your feelings towards me?"
Elizabeth felt herself becoming angrier every moment, yet she tried to speak calmly. She said, "You are mistaken again, Mr. Darcy. Because you declared your love to me in this manner, I am not concerned about hurting you with my refusal." She saw that he was ready to respond to this, but he said nothing. "It is not only this. You could not have made me an offer of marriage in any possible way that would have caused me to accept." Again his amazement was clear. She continued, "You know that I am being truly honest with you. When I first met you, I saw your pride, your belief that other people are below you. I also saw that you were selfish, that you do not care about the feelings of others. I felt that if you were the last man in the world, I still could never marry you."
"You have said quite enough for now, madam. I understand perfectly your feelings, and now I have only to be ashamed of what my own feelings have been. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time."
With these words, he quickly left the room. Elizabeth heard him soon leave the house. Her mind and heart were both in a mess. She sat down and cried for half an hour. She could not believe that she had received an offer of marriage from Mr. Darcy. She could not believe that he had been in love with her for so many months. In fact, he was so much in love that he wished to marry her despite her background, the same background that made him stop Bingley from marrying Jane. She knew then that his affection for her was very strong, but she could not forget his pride and his uncaring manner toward what he had done to Jane. Also, she remembered his coldness when she had mentioned Wickham. This soon destroyed any pity which Elizabeth had for a moment felt. She cried and worried until she heard Lady Catherine's carriage. Then she hurried away to her room. Chapter 11. A Young Lady Thinks About Matters. When she awoke the next morning, Elizabeth began to think again about the same thoughts which she had fallen asleep to. It was impossible to think of anything else, and she did not feel any better. After breakfast, she went out on her favorite walk. Then she remembered that she had often met Mr. Darcy there, so she walked up a street that ran next to the park instead. She was passing one of the gates when she saw a gentleman approaching. Afraid that it was Mr. Darcy, she hurried to turn away. But she was not quick enough, and the gentleman stepped forward and called her name. She recognized the voice of Mr. Darcy. He was holding out a letter and said, looking deeply at her,
"Will you do me the honor and read this letter?"
Then, with a slight bow, he turned away, and she soon lost sight of him among the trees. Elizabeth was very curious. She opened the letter and, walking slowly, began to read it.
"Do not be afraid, madam, by this letter. I do not write about those offers which last night caused you so much pain. I hope you will forgive my free action of asking for your attention. But I must speak to you about two things that you said I was guilty of. The first was that, despite the feelings of both people, I made Mr. Bingley leave your sister. The second was that I had ruined the future wealth of Mr. Wickham. After you read this letter about my actions and their reasons, I hope to be excused of the blame which you put on me last night. It was not long in Hertfordshire before I knew that Bingley had feelings for your older sister. In fact, I knew that he liked her more than any other young woman there. Knowing him as I have, I must say that I had often seen him in love before. But at the dance at Netherfield, I became aware that his feelings for Miss Bennet were much greater than any I had ever seen in him before. I also watched your sister. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, and as pleasant. But I came to believe that she did not really care for Bingley. If you are not mistaken about the truth of your sister's love, then I am wrong and your hatred for me is correct. But other causes made me worry about Miss Bennet. The social background of your mother's family only bothered me a little. What really upset me was their total lack of manners, which her and your 3 younger sisters showed that night. Please excuse me. It pains me to hurt you. I hope you understand that I have nothing but high feelings toward the conduct of yourself and Miss Jane Bennet. I only wished to save my friend from what I thought to be a most unhappy marriage in the future. I lied and told him that your sister did not return his feelings. Then I took him off to London. Please let me also say there is another part of my actions which I am not happy with. I hid from Mr. Bingley the fact that your sister was also in town. He does not even know about it. I now feel that this was a very low way of acting. If I have hurt your sister's feelings or caused her pain, then I did this unknowingly. About injuring Mr. Wickham, which you brought up last night, I can only explain by telling you the history of his connection with my family. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man. His father had taken care of the management of the Pemberley property for many years. My father was grateful to him and supported Mr. Wickham's son at school. He also continued to support him when he went to university at Cambridge. Mr. Wickham was not able to educate his own son because of lack of money. My father greatly enjoyed the company of Mr. Wickham's son, and he hoped that the son would choose the church as his job. The son's life, however, was full of lazy times, and he was not responsible. But he was very careful to keep my father from knowing about his life. However, I was also a young man of the same age, and it was easy for me to know. When my father died, Wickham wrote me a letter. He said that he had decided not to enter into the church. Instead, he had decided to study law. My father had left him £1,000, and he said that this would not be enough to support him through law school. I wished, rather than believed, that he was telling me the truth. I knew before that he had no plans to work for the church. He left the church and asked for a total of £3,000. I never answered, and I thought that our relationship would end at the time. Though he lived in town, he was not studying law. 3 years later, he wrote to me again and asked me to give him the £3,000. He said that my father had promised it to him. Maybe now you can understand why I refused to do so. But this was not the end. Last summer, he came back into my life. My sister, Georgiana, who is 16 years old, had been at Ramsgate, which is where her teacher, a lady, teaches and educates her. Mr. Wickham went there and started to visit Georgiana. After this, Georgiana was certain that she was in love with him, and she agreed to a secret marriage. I went to visit her unexpectedly a day or two before they planned to marry. Georgiana could not bear the thought of hurting me, so she told me of their plan. I wrote a letter to Mr. Wickham asking him about the marriage, and he left the place immediately. It was easy to tell that his main purpose was getting my sister's fortune, which is £30,000. I also cannot help believing that he hoped to take revenge upon me by making my sister's life miserable. These, madam, are the true facts about everything we spoke about last night. You may possibly be wondering why I did not tell you about this last night. At the time, I was very upset by your refusal and did not know what I could or ought to say. If you feel the need to check on the truth of these events, you can speak to Colonel Fitzwilliam. He was one of the lawyers of my father's will, so he has much knowledge of these happenings. I will only add, God bless you, Darcy.
Elizabeth's feelings were very confused after she finished the letter. First, she was amazed that he believed an apology would fix anything. His reasons against the match between Bingley and Jane made her very angry. It was all pride on his part. His story about Mr. Wickham, however, made her feel surprised and afraid. "It cannot be. It must be false," she told herself. But then she reread the letter and had no doubt about its truth. She remembered the conversation between Wickham and herself, She remembered that he had told her that he did not fear Mr. Darcy. Yet he had not attended the Netherfield dance. He had also told another lie. He said that his respect for the father would always stop him from saying bad things about the son. But how quick he was to tell her about how Darcy had wronged him. Everything now appeared very differently. This made Elizabeth feel very ashamed of herself. She realized that she had been blind, prejudiced, and foolish toward both Darcy and Wickham. Then she thought about Jane and her behavior at the dance. She realized that Jane had not shown her feelings very strongly. Still, she knew that it was not like a lady to act so. When she remembered her mother's behavior during the supper at Netherfield, she understood Darcy's belief. She herself had been embarrassed by Mrs. Bennet's behavior. When she realized that Jane's disappointment was because of her sisters and mother, she felt unhappier than she had ever been before. At last, she decided to return home. She immediately learned that the two gentlemen from Rosings had each called on her while she was away. Mr. Darcy only stayed for a few minutes, but Colonel Fitzwilliam had been sitting with them for at least an hour, hoping for her return. Elizabeth pretended to be concerned that she had missed him, but she was secretly grateful. She was too upset for polite talk. She could think only of her letter. The next morning, the two gentlemen left Rosings. Chapter 12. A young lady goes to Brighton. A fortnight later, Elizabeth left Hunsford. After 4 hours from Kent, she reached Mr. Gardiner's house. She was to remain a few days there before travelling home with Jane. Jane looked very well, and Elizabeth decided not to tell her sister of Mr. Darcy's proposal of marriage to her. She was afraid that his name would remind her sister of Bingley. Finally, the two young ladies left Gracechurch Street and arrived home at last to Longbourn. Their sisters were very delighted to see them after so long a time. Mrs. Bennet was quite happy to see that Jane had not lost her beauty. Mr. Bennet said, more than once during dinner,
"I am glad you are back, Lizzie."
After they had returned home for 2 weeks, the family was gathered together when Mr. Bennet appeared, a letter in his hand. The letter was an invitation from a Mrs. Forster. She was the wife of the colonel of the army which had been stationed at Meryton. Mrs. Forster had written to ask Lydia to join her for a month at Brighton. This friend was a very young woman, and her good humour had made Lydia warm and friendly towards her. Lydia was filled with joy and flew about the house in restless happiness. But Kitty was very sad. "I don't know why Mrs. Forster did not ask me as well," complained Kitty. Elizabeth tried, without success, to make Kitty see that this was not a great opportunity. Jane also tried to make her feel better. The invitation did not excite Elizabeth as much as it did her mother. She believed it to be the death of all common sense in Lydia. "She is an extremely silly girl, Papa, and she flirts horribly with men. If she goes to Brighton camp, she is likely to make both herself and her family appear quite ridiculous. Mrs. Forster is not much better. She has no more sense of good manners than Lydia, and Lydia will follow wherever she goes."
"Do not trouble yourself, my love,"
replied Mr. Bennet.
"If Lydia does not go to Brighton, we will have no peace. Let her go then. Colonel Forster is a sensible man. He will keep her out of any real trouble."
Elizabeth had to be content with this answer. Had Lydia known that this was the way Elizabeth felt, she would have forever been angry with her. A visit to Brighton offered Lydia every chance at happiness. In her mind, she imagined the streets filled with handsome young officers from the army. She imagined herself to be the centre of attention there. On the day she left for Brighton, Kitty was the only one who cried. But she cried out of jealousy rather than Lydia's absence. Mrs. Bennet told her daughter to enjoy herself as much as possible. There was every reason to believe this advice would be followed. The gentler goodbyes of her older sisters went unheard. For a week or so, both Mrs. Bennet and Kitty complained about how boring everything around them was. This threw a darkness over the house. Elizabeth soon began to look forward to her tour to the lakes. This was her best medicine against all the uncomfortable hours listening to the unhappiness of Kitty and her mother. Finally, after the first fortnight of Lydia's absence, good humour was again at Longbourn. Families who had been away for the winter came back again, and summer visits again became common. Mrs. Bennet was again quite peaceful, and Kitty felt so much better that she only talked about officers once a day. Elizabeth's northern tour of the lakes was fast approaching, but one day a letter arrived from Mrs. Gardiner. She wrote that her husband, because of business, could not leave until July. This was because he had to be in London again within a month. As this was too short a time for them to go so far, they could only go as far north as Derbyshire. This was where Mrs. Gardiner had grown up, near the town of Lambton. Elizabeth was disappointed. She had really wanted to see the lakes, but it was her way to be satisfied with what she had, and all was soon right again. But the name of Derbyshire brought many ideas to her. It was impossible for her to see the word without thinking of Pemberley and its owner, Mr. Darcy. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner finally appeared at Longbourn, where they stayed overnight. The next morning they set off with Elizabeth toward Derbyshire. When they had spent some time in the countryside, they decided to go towards the little town of Lambton. Elizabeth discovered from her aunt that Pemberley was located only 5 miles from Lambton. Mrs. Gardiner also said that she wished to see the place. Elizabeth was upset. She did not want to go to Pemberley, but could not say so without giving an explanation. The chance of meeting Mr. Darcy while they were looking at the place filled her with fear. Before she went to bed that night, she asked the maid at their inn if the family at Pemberley were there for the summer. The answer no brought her relief. She stopped feeling nervous, and she felt very curious to see the house for herself. When they rose the next morning, she could truthfully answer that she was happy to go. To Pemberley, therefore, they went. Chapter 13. A Young Man Changed. Elizabeth's excitement was very high as she watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods. Finally, they turned toward the house. The park was very large and had a great variety of trees and plants. They entered it at one of its lowest points and drove for some time through a beautiful wood. Slowly, about half a mile, they were at the top of a hill. The wood stopped here, and their eyes were instantly caught by Pemberley House. It was located on the opposite side of a valley. It was a large, handsome stone building that stood on high ground and was backed by high woody hills. A river ran in front of it, with trees lined on its banks. Elizabeth was delighted. At that moment she thought what it would be like to be the mistress of Pemberley. She thought it would indeed be something to be proud of. They came down the hill and drove to the door. When they asked to see the place, they were let into the hall. The housekeeper came. She was a respectable-looking elderly lady who was more polite than Elizabeth had expected. They followed her into the dining room. It was a large room with handsome furniture. From its windows, the hill, upon which were many trees, was very beautiful. All the rooms in the house had high ceilings. This added to the beauty of the house. The furniture and decorations had great style, and from every window there were beauties to be seen. Elizabeth really wanted to ask the housekeeper whether the master was really absent, but she was not brave enough. Finally, her uncle asked her if the master was present. The servant, Mrs. Reynolds, replied that he was not, but then added, "But we expect him tomorrow with a party of friends."
"Is your master here at Pemberley much of the year?"
Mr. Gardiner asked. "Not so much as I could wish, sir." "If he were to marry, you might see more of him," suggested Mrs. Gardiner. "Yes, madam, but I don't know when this will happen. I do not know who is good enough for him." Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled. Elizabeth said, "I'm sure your opinion of him makes him respect you very much." "I say no more than what is true," replied the servant. "He is the best landlord and the best master that ever lived. There is not one of his servants that will complain about him. Some people call him proud, but I don't think I've ever seen him this way." "Can this be the same Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth wondered. They entered the picture room. Here there were many paintings of the family, and Elizabeth stopped in front of a particular painting. It was a painting that looked like Mr. Wickham, and it was hung among several other pictures. The housekeeper approached Elizabeth and told her that it was not a picture of someone related to the family. Instead, it was the picture of a young gentleman who had been brought up by her late master. The late master had used his own money in raising the child. "That man is now in the army," she added, "but I am afraid that his character has turned out to be very wild." Elizabeth walked on to look for another face that she knew. Finally, she stopped in front of a painting that looked like Mr. Darcy. She stood looking at it for many minutes, and then she returned to it again before they left the gallery. Having seen all parts of the house that were open to the public, they thanked the housekeeper and said good-bye. Then the gardener met them to show them the grounds around the house. As they walked through the garden towards the river, Elizabeth turned to look back. She saw Mr. Darcy approaching from another road that led to where the horses were kept. His appearance was so sudden that it was impossible to miss him. Their eyes instantly met, and both of their cheeks became deep red. He stood, not moving from surprise. Then he came forward and spoke to Elizabeth, calmly and politely. Both Mrs. Gardiner and her husband stood a little away while they were talking. Elizabeth, who was surprised and confused, could hardly lift her eyes to look at his face. She was hardly able to answer all the questions which he asked about her family. Finally, after standing a few moments without saying a word, he bowed to her and said good-bye. Her aunt and uncle then joined her and told her they greatly admired his appearance. But Elizabeth herself could not hear a word. She felt both ashamed and worried. She thought he would consider her most strange, as if she had come to Pemberley on purpose. Oh, why did she come? She asked herself. Or, why had he come back a day before he was expected, and his behavior and manner was so different than before? What could it mean? She was amazed that he had even decided to speak to her, but to speak with such politeness, to ask after her family. Never had she heard him speak with such gentleness as on this unexpected meeting. Then they entered a beautiful walk by the side of the river. Soon they were again surprised by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching. He asked Elizabeth if she would introduce him to her friends. He stated that it would be his honor. He began a conversation with Mr. Gardiner and started to accompany them back to the house. Elizabeth felt quite pleased. She wanted Darcy to know that she had some relations which were not as embarrassing as her mother and younger sisters. She felt pride every time her uncle showed his intelligence and good manners. The party stopped to look at some unusual water plants, and Mrs. Gardiner took her husband's arm. Mr. Darcy then took his place beside Elizabeth, and they walked on together. After a short silence, Elizabeth told him that she had been told that he would not be there when they came to Pemberley. He explained that business had brought him ahead of the party that was arriving the next day.
"Mr. Bingley and his sisters will come,"
he said. Elizabeth answered only by making a slight bow.
"There is another person in the party that arrives tomorrow,"
he continued after a short while,
"whom I should like you to meet." Will you allow me to introduce my sister to you while you are staying at Lambton?"
Elizabeth was very surprised at his request. She felt he was quite generous. It was good to know that her earlier bad feelings toward him had not made him think wrongly of her. Elizabeth was both flattered and pleased. When they reached their carriage, Darcy politely asked them to come inside the house for some tea. However, they did not accept this offer because they wished to reach Lambton before dark. They left Mr. Darcy with much politeness. When the carriage drove off, Elizabeth turned and saw him walking slowly towards the house. Her uncle and aunt began to speak about the good feelings they had toward Mr. Darcy. They felt that he was a man of good manners and attentiveness. Elizabeth herself felt that she liked him better than ever before. Elizabeth had arranged with Darcy that he would bring his sister to visit her the day after the party reached Pemberley. But instead, these visitors arrived the very next morning. When the introduction took place, Elizabeth saw to her surprise that Miss Darcy was almost as embarrassed as she was. She had heard from Wickham that Miss Darcy was very proud. Instead, she found that Miss Darcy was extremely shy. She was taller than Elizabeth and less handsome than her brother, but her face was full of good humor and her manners were gentle. They had not been together very long before Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to join them. Soon they heard footsteps on the stair, and Bingley entered the room. All of Elizabeth's anger went away once she saw him, and she was once again surprised by his friendliness. He asked her about her family, and looked and spoke with the same good humor that he had always done. She could not be fooled by his behavior toward Miss Darcy. There was nothing between them that showed they had any special feelings for each other. When the others were talking together, he told Elizabeth that it was a very long time since he had had the pleasure of seeing her. Before she could reply, he added,
"It is about 8 months. We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield."
It pleased her to see that his memory was so exact. After waiting a moment, Bingley asked whether all of her sisters were at Longbourn. Though it was a simple question, Elizabeth understood the special meaning behind it. When everyone was ready to leave, Mr. Darcy and his sister expressed their wish of having Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Miss Bennet to dinner at Pemberley. It was decided that they would meet for dinner the day after the next. When the visitors had gone, Elizabeth thought that their visit had been one of great satisfaction. She wanted to be alone, because she was fearful of questions from her uncle and aunt. She stayed with them only long enough to hear that they thought most highly of Bingley. Her thoughts were of Pemberley all that evening. The evening was not long enough for her to decide how she felt about Darcy. Her hatred toward him had disappeared long ago, and she now felt ashamed about ever disliking him. Above all, she felt very grateful, not because he had once loved her, but because he loved her enough to forgive the way that she had not accepted his offer. He might have tried to avoid meeting her, but it seemed, on this accidental meeting, that he wanted to keep the friendship. Indeed, he tried to make her relations have a good opinion of him, and he wanted to introduce her to his sister. She wondered how much happiness it would bring to both of them if she were to encourage his feelings of love for her. Chapter 14. A Young Lady Runs Away. The next morning, 2 letters came from Jane. One of them had been sent to the wrong address. They had just been preparing to go on a walk when the letters came. Her uncle and aunt, leaving Elizabeth alone to enjoy them in quiet, began their walk. The one that had the wrong address had been written 5 days ago. The beginning contained nothing of great importance, but the second half, dated a day later, contained more important news. "Something most serious has happened since I wrote the beginning of this letter. At 12 last night, just as we had all gone to bed, an important message came from Colonel Forster. He said that Lydia had run away to Scotland with Wickham. Imagine our surprise. I'm sure his action is not so that he can get money, at least, for he must know that our father only has very little. Our poor mother is greatly upset. Our father is handling it better. Lydia and Wickham set off on Saturday night, it is guessed, but nobody noticed they had gone until yesterday morning. Colonel Forster is expected to arrive here soon. Lydia left a short note for his wife, telling her of their plan. Elizabeth instantly opened the other letter and read it. It had been written a day later. By this time you will have received my hurried letter. I hope this will make sense to you. My head is so confused I hardly know what I am writing. I have bad news. We know that a most unwise marriage between Wickham and our poor Lydia has taken place, but there is reason to believe that they have not left for Scotland. Colonel Forster arrived yesterday. Though Lydia had written in her short letter to Mrs. F. that they were going to Gretna Green in Scotland, a friend of Wickham's told them that he believed Wickham never planned to go there, or to marry Lydia at all. When Colonel F. heard about this, he immediately set off from Brighton, hoping to find them. He followed their route all the way to Clapham, but could not find any farther signs. All that is known after this is that they were seen continuing along the London road. After finding out all he could, Colonel F. came to Longbourn and told us of his worries. Our fear, my dear Lizzie, is very great. Colonel F. said he knew that Wickham was not a man to be trusted. Poor mother is really ill and stays in her room, and as for father, I have never seen him so worried in all my life. I am glad that you are not here in the middle of these horrible events, but I still want you to return. I cannot help myself from begging you all to come here as soon as possible. My father is going to London with Colonel Forster to try to discover where they are. At this time, Uncle's advice and help would be everything in the world. "Oh, where is Uncle?" cried Elizabeth. She quickly walked to the door. Just then, the door was opened by a servant, and Mr. Darcy appeared. Her white face and worried look surprised him. "I'm very sorry," Elizabeth exclaimed, "but you must excuse me, because I must find Mr. Gardiner. I don't have a second to lose."
"Good God! What is the matter?"
he cried, with more feeling than politeness.
"Please allow me, or allow the servant, to go after your uncle. You do not look well enough."
Elizabeth tried to argue, but her knees were shaking under her. She called back the servant and asked him to bring his master home immediately. Then she sat down.
"Let me call your maid to bring you something,"
said Darcy gently.
"A glass of wine. Shall I get you one?"
"No, thank you. There is nothing the matter with me. I'm quite well. I am only upset by some horrible news which I have just received from Longbourn." She burst into tears and could not speak another word. Darcy was greatly worried, but he could only watch her in silence. At length she spoke again. "I have just received a letter from Jane. It has such horrible, awful news. My younger sister has run off to marry, to be with Mr. Wickham. When I think that I might have stopped this from happening. I knew what he was and told no one. Had I told my family of his character, this could not have happened."
"I am most sorry,"
said Darcy.
"But it is certain? Completely certain?"
"Oh, yes. They left Brighton together on Sunday night, and Colonel Forster found that they had made it as far as London, but not further. They have certainly not gone to Scotland, as Lydia wrote to Mrs. Forster."
"What has been done to bring her back?"
he asked. "My father has gone to London, and Jane has written to ask my uncle for his immediate help. We must go back to Longbourn. I hope we can leave in half an hour. But nothing can be done. How are we even going to discover them?" Darcy did not answer. It seemed that he was hardly listening to her. He walked up and down the room, his head bent, his manner dark. Elizabeth understood what he must be thinking. He could no longer wish to be with her after such a display of family weakness, such a deep mistake. His response made her understand her own wishes. She realized that she strongly loved him.
"I wish to heaven that I could do something to help you,"
he said.
"But I cannot. This bad situation will, I fear, stop my sister from wanting to visit you at Pemberley."
"Yes, please be so kind and apologize for us. Say that very important business calls us home immediately." He bowed, and with a serious look, went away. Elizabeth felt that it was unlikely that they should ever see each other again on such friendly terms. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner had hurried back. They were very worried and feared that their niece was suddenly ill. Promising both of them this was not true, Elizabeth read the 2 letters aloud to them. After the first cries of surprise and horror, Mr. Gardiner promised to help in every way he could. Elizabeth thanked him gratefully, and soon their journey was quickly settled. In a short space of time, Elizabeth found herself seated in the carriage and on the road back to Longbourn. They travelled as quickly as possible. They stopped and slept for 1 night on the way, so as to reach Longbourn by the next day. As soon as they pulled up to the house, Elizabeth jumped from the carriage and hurried into the hall. Jane, who had come running downstairs, immediately met her. They hugged, and Elizabeth asked whether she had heard of any new news. "Not yet," replied Jane. "And, Mother, how is she? How are you all?" "Mother's feelings are greatly shaken. She will not leave her room. Mary and Kitty, thank heaven, are both quite well." Then Jane went to greet her aunt and uncle. They went to Mrs. Bennet's room. She received them with tears and complaints of her problems. "I always knew that the Forsters were not able to take good care of my poor dear Lydia," she said, "but no one would listen to me as usual. And now Mr. Bennet has gone away, and he will fight Wickham, and he will be killed. Then the Collinses will make us move out after his death. I do not know what we shall do." They all told her to stop thinking such horrible ideas. Mr. Gardiner told her that he would go to London the very next day to help Mr. Bennet in his search for them. Everyone was hoping for a letter from Mr. Bennet the next morning, but nothing arrived. On Tuesday, a letter from Mr. Gardiner came to say that he had found Mr. Bennet and asked him to go with him to Gracechurch Street. Mr. Bennet had, he said, learned no new information. Now they had decided to ask at all the major hotels. Every day at Longbourn was now one of worry. Mr. Gardiner's next letter said that they might expect to see their father arrive home on the following day, which was Saturday. Mr. Bennet was without hope of ever finding them, and he had agreed to the idea of his brother-in-law to return to his family. Mr. Gardiner would continue to search for them alone. When Mrs. Bennet heard this, she did not seem as happy as her children expected. "What? Is he coming home without poor Lydia?" she cried. "Surely he will not leave London before he has found them. Who will fight Wickham, then, and make him marry her?" When Mr. Bennet did arrive the next morning, he seemed as calm as ever. He said very little, but this was his usual way, and made no talk about the unpleasant business Lydia had caused them. When he joined them at tea later in the afternoon, Elizabeth decided to say that she was sorry for all that he had recently been through.
"Who should be blamed but myself?"
he replied.
"It has been my own doing, and I deserve it."
They were interrupted by Jane, who came to fetch her mother's tea.
"Your mother's way of acting,"
he said,
"gives a new definition to being ill. One day I will perhaps do the same. I will sit in my library, in my cap and gown, and give everyone as much trouble as I can. Or perhaps I shall wait until Kitty runs away."
"I am not going to run away, Papa," said Kitty. "If I should ever go to Brighton, I would behave better."
"You go to Brighton? I would not trust you to go as near it as Eastbourne. No, Kitty, I have at last learned that I must be very careful. No officer is going to enter my house ever again, and you are not allowed to go to any more dances. And I will not let you outside again until you can prove that you have spent 10 minutes each day in a wise and thoughtful manner."
Kitty, who took all of this seriously, began to cry.
Well, well,
he said,
"don't be unhappy. If you are a good girl for the next 10 years, Then I will take you to the theatre at the end of them.
Chapter 15. A Young Lady Recovered. 2 days after Mr. Bennet's return, Jane and Elizabeth came upon their father as they were walking in the woods. He held a letter in his hand. "Papa, is this news?" cried Elizabeth. "Good or bad?"
I am not sure, my dear, but perhaps you would like to read it. Read it aloud so that Jane can hear it and tell me her thoughts. I hardly know myself what it is about.
Gracechurch Street, Monday, August 2nd. My dear brother, at last I am able to send you news about your daughter. Soon after you left me, I was able to find out that they were in a certain part of London. I have already been to see both of them. They are not married, nor is there any hope of making them do so. But if you agree to the arrangements I have made for you, I hope they will marry before long. You must guarantee your daughter her equal share of the £5,000 that has been promised to your daughters after the death of yourself and my sister. Also, you must agree to give her £100 every year as long as you are alive. Mr. Wickham says that he hopes to leave the military and become an officer in the regular army. This he has agreed to do as soon as his marriage is fixed. He has old friends that are both able and willing to help him in the army. General Lambrey, who is now based in the north, has promised to place him under his care. There is not the smallest reason for you to come to town again. We think it best that my niece be married from this house. When they are married, they will then move to the north, unless they are first invited to Longbourn. I know that Lydia really wants to see you all before she goes to the north. She is well, and begs that you and her mother remember her. Yours, etc., E. Gardner. "Have you written an answer to this letter yet, Papa?" Elizabeth asked.
No, but I must do so soon.
"May we take my uncle's letter to Mother?" she asked.
Do so,
he replied.
I am quite interested in hearing what she has to say.
Elizabeth and Jane went upstairs together. Mary and Kitty were both with Mrs. Bennet, and the letter was read aloud to them. Mrs. Bennet was not disturbed in any way by Lydia's shameful actions. She seemed happy to know that she was to be married. "My dear, dear Lydia!" she cried. "This is delightful indeed. She will soon be married. How I long to see her, and to see dear Mr. Wickham, too. But what about the wedding clothes? Lizzie, my dear, please run downstairs and ask your father how much he will give her for clothes. No, wait, stay, and I will go myself. I will put on my things after a moment. Oh, my dear, dear Lydia, how happy I shall be when we meet." It had been a fortnight since Mrs. Bennet had left her room and gone downstairs. But she was so happy that she again took her seat at the head of the dinner table. Imagine her horror and surprise when Mr. Bennet refused her requests. He said that he would not receive either Lydia or her husband at Longbourn, and that he would certainly not give any money for wedding clothes. Mrs. Bennet immediately began to argue with Mr. Bennet, but Jane and Elizabeth calmed their father, saying that her marriage should be noticed by the family. At last, Mr. Bennet agreed. As for Mrs. Bennet, she was happy that she would be able to show off her married daughter before Lydia was sent off to live in the north. On the day of their sister's wedding, the family gathered in the living-room. Mrs. Bennet was smiling as the carriage drove up to the door. Her husband, however, looked serious and unhappy, and her daughters uncomfortable. Everyone heard Lydia's voice in the hall. Soon the door was thrown open, and she came running into the room. Mrs. Bennet stepped forward, hugged her, and then greeted Wickham with a warm smile. Mr. Bennet remained serious and hardly said a word. Elizabeth found herself disgusted at Lydia's behavior. Lydia was still the same, uncontrolled, noisy, and without fear. Wickham was all smiles and conversation. He seemed no more uncomfortable than his wife. "I had no idea," cried Lydia, "that I would be married when I came back, but I often thought it would be good fun if I was." Her good spirits increased as the day went on. She wanted to see all their neighbours and have them call her Mrs. Wickham. After dinner she went to show her ring to the housekeeper and the maids, boasting about being married. The visitors were to stay for 10 days. Wickham had to join his army in a fortnight, as his orders instructed him to do. Elizabeth knew that his feelings for Lydia were not as much as Lydia's for him. Still, this is what she had expected to find. One morning Lydia was sitting with her 2 elder sisters. She turned to Elizabeth and said, "Lizzie, I never did tell you about my wedding. Aren't you curious to hear about it?" "Not really," replied Elizabeth. "I think the less that is said about the subject, the better." "La, you are so strange!" "But I do need to tell you how it happened. Well, it was Uncle who found us, as I'm sure you know. He found out that we were staying where Wickham used to live in town. When Uncle arrived, he insisted on taking me home. We were going to be married at St. Clement's, and it was finally agreed upon to be there at 11 o'clock. I was in such a worried state. I was so afraid that my dear Wickham would not be there. But when Uncle and I arrived at the church, he was there, looking so handsome, with Mr. Darcy looking very serious beside him." "Mr. Darcy?" repeated Elizabeth. She was quite shocked to hear his name. "Oh, yes. He came there with Wickham, you know. But dear me, how I forgot! What will Wickham say to me now? It was to be a secret. I shouldn't tell you this, but it was really Mr. Darcy who came and found us in London. He made Wickham agree to marry me. At first, Darcy tried to make me leave Wickham and return home to you. I told him that I loved Wickham, and he was the only man for me. In the end, Mr. Darcy went to find Uncle, and the 3 of them argued to see how much money Wickham should get if he married me." "How much he should have?" said Elizabeth. "Oh, that's so horrible." "La, why should you say that? Mr. Darcy's so rich. Why shouldn't he make a gift to his father's godson?" "What sort of a deal did they make for you, Lydia?" asked Elizabeth coldly. "Well, Wickham's had debts of more than £1,000. Mr. Darcy agreed to pay these off. Then it was agreed that he would pay Wickham £1,000 to marry me, plus buy him a job in the regular army." "But poor papa can never, ever repay all that money to Mr. Darcy," replied Jane, worried. "He doesn't ever need to know," cried Lydia joyfully. "Mr. Darcy made us promise not to tell anyone." "Then please do not say another word," said Jane quickly. "Please do not tell Wickham I've told you this. He'd be so angry at me. You know, he doesn't like Mr. Darcy." "Do not worry. I won't say a word," said Elizabeth angrily. "You know, Lizzie," said Lydia, "you and Jane should make a trip to Brighton. That really is the place to get husbands." "I'm afraid I don't like your way of getting husbands," Elizabeth replied coldly. She quickly left the room. Lydia's news gave Elizabeth both pain and pleasure. It was painful to know that they could never return Mr. Darcy's favour, that they owed the health of Lydia, her character, everything to Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth knew that he neither respected nor liked Lydia. Something in her heart told her that he had done it for her. The pain was also strong when she realized that he could no longer have any feelings for her. She had already refused his offer, and now she was the sister-in-law of Wickham, whom he hated. There would not be any way to make him want any connection with the family that included Wickham. Elizabeth could hardly bear the rest of Lydia and her husband's visit. When Mr. Wickham said goodbye, he became very charming and smiled, looked handsome, and said many pretty things. Mrs. Bennet was bored for several days after Lydia left. Then news arrived that made her happy once more. Mr. Bingley had returned to Netherfield. Chapter 16. 2 Young Happy Couples. 2 days later, Mrs. Bennet had left for Meryton that morning when both Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy called at Longbourn. Jane and Elizabeth were sitting on the sofa when they entered the room. Jane turned red as Mr. Bingley came towards her. He looked both happy and embarrassed to see her. Elizabeth looked at Darcy and saw he looked as serious as usual.
"Miss Bennet,"
said Bingley to Jane.
This is a great pleasure for me. Are you well?"
"Indeed, sir," replied Jane, looking into his eyes. "I am very well."
"Miss Elizabeth,"
said Darcy.
"I hope you also offer me a good welcome."
"Mr. Darcy, believe me that I am very glad to see you," Elizabeth replied. "Did you enjoy your recent stay in town, Mr. Bingley?" asked Jane.
"Quite simply, no,"
he replied.
"In these past months I have decided that I prefer the countryside to the town. In fact,"
put in Mr. Darcy,
"after much discussion, we realize that we both prefer the country." "Miss Bennet,"
said Bingley to Jane,
"it is such a beautiful country day that I find it impossible to be inside. Will you walk with me in the park?"
Jane stood to go at once. "I should be most happy, sir. Will you come with us too, Elizabeth?" "Gladly," said Elizabeth, and she stood up to go.
"Please, Miss Elizabeth,"
said Darcy,
"I would be most grateful if you could stay.
He waved Bingley toward the door.
I have to speak to you privately."
Elizabeth sat down again and lowered her eyes. There was a short silence. Mr. Darcy began to walk up and down. Elizabeth looked at him. "Mr. Darcy," she said, a little nervous, I have to thank you for your kindness to Lydia. I really am grateful."
"You know about that?"
asked Darcy, surprised.
"I'm sorry. I didn't want you to be told. I did not think that your uncle would tell you."
"You're mistaken, Mr. Darcy. My uncle did not say anything. It was Lydia who was being thoughtless. Let me thank you again and again, especially for my family."
"Please,"
he replied, coming towards her,
"let your thanks be for yourself alone. I only wish to give you happiness."
Elizabeth was too embarrassed to say anything. Her companion added,
"I know you are too honest to lie to me. Are your feelings still the same as they were last April?"
Elizabeth shook her head. "No, since that time, my feelings have completely changed," she said. He took her hands and made her stand. Seeing that he felt great delight, Elizabeth knew that she, too, was full of happiness.
"My feelings and wishes have not changed,"
he said quietly.
"Elizabeth, will you marry me?"
"Oh, yes," she cried. "Can you forgive me for hurting you?"
"There is nothing to forgive,"
he replied.
"I was taught a lesson. You properly humbled me."
"I'm sure you hated me after that evening."
"Hated you? It's true I was angry at first, but my anger soon made me see that my decision to stop Bingley's marriage was wrong. Before we left London, I told him that I was wrong in believing that your sister had no feelings for him. I told him that she had been in town all last winter, and that I had known it, but purposely kept it from him. He was very angry with me. I convinced him that your sister still had feelings for him, which made him less angry with me. He has forgiven me now."
Elizabeth was just about to say that Mr. Bingley was a most delightful friend when the door opened and Jane entered. "Elizabeth," she cried happily, "my dearest Lizzie, I am now the happiest creature in the world. Charles has asked me to marry him. We are engaged." They hugged each other warmly. "Jane, I know you will be very happy."
"Miss Bennet, I too am sure you two will find great happiness together,"
said Darcy.
"But where is Charles?"
"He has already gone into the library to speak with my father."
"In the library? Good. I must also ask for Mr. Bennet's permission and best wishes."
Jane was amazed as she watched Darcy leave towards the library. She looked at Elizabeth wide-eyed. Elizabeth only smiled and nodded. "We too are engaged," she said. "I am also the happiest creature in the world." "Are you joking, Lizzie? This cannot be. It's impossible." "Oh, this is a bit of a sad beginning, isn't it?" replied Elizabeth, still smiling. "I'm sure nobody else will believe me if you do not. I speak the truth when I say that he loves me and we are engaged to be married." Jane still looked at her as if she did not believe her. "Can it really be true? My dear Lizzie, then I congratulate you. But are you certain that you will be happy together?" "It is already agreed between us that we are to be the happiest couple in the world." "Oh, Lizzie!" cried Jane, holding her sister. "Nothing could give either Bingley or me more delight than this news. It was Mr. Darcy who brought Charles back here. Oh, how is it possible to have so much happiness?" They both turned as Bingley stepped joyfully into the room.
"Jane, my dear,"
he said,
"your father has given his permission for our engagement."
"How could he say no?" asked Elizabeth, laughing. "Mr. Bingley, I am happy to welcome you as a brother."
"And I am happy to have the good wishes of a sister,"
replied Bingley, warmly shaking her hand. "Listen, there's Mother's carriage," cried Jane. "I must go and tell her. Charles, you must come with me."
"Of course,"
cried Bingley.
"Of course."
"Will you also tell her my news, Jane?" asked Elizabeth. She was worried. Jane happily agreed. Elizabeth walked to the window. She did not know how her father and mother would handle the news of her engagement. She doubted that even Darcy's wealth would change her mother's dislike of him, and she wasn't sure about her father's wishes. She turned as the door opened and her father entered the room, looking serious.
"Lizzie,"
he said,
"I have asked Mr. Darcy to wait in the library."
He sat down on the sofa and began.
"Are you out of your mind to accept this man's offer? I always thought you greatly disliked him."
"Papa," she said, embarrassed, "I did dislike him at first, this is true, but I always had a respect for him, I think. I don't know how to explain when it began."
"So you have decided to have him as a husband, then? He is very rich. Will all the fine clothes and carriages make you happy?"
"Is there any other reason why you do not agree?" said Elizabeth anxiously. "Other than your believing I do not care for him?"
"No other. We all know him as being proud and unpleasant. But this is nothing if you really like him." I do like him," she replied. "I love him. Please do not pain me by talking about him in such a way." "Lizzie," said her father, "I have already given him my permission. After hearing your side, I now give it to you, if you have decided to make him your husband." "Oh, yes, Papa. His feelings for me have stood the test of many months. He has qualities you do not know. Indeed, we owe him very much, as I will be able to show you some day." Mr. Bennet took her hands in his. "Well, my dear, I can say no more. If this is true, then he deserves you. I could not have let you have, my dear Lizzie, anyone of less character." As he kissed her, Mrs. Bennet entered the room. She was too excited to think clearly. "Good heaven!" she exclaimed. "Mr. Bingley! Lord bless me! Mr. Darcy! Only think! Dear me! Mr. Darcy!" "This is a day for wonders, my dear," said her husband. "Two rich young men have asked me to marry Jane and Elizabeth at the earliest opportunity." Mrs. Bennet hugged her daughter. "Good gracious! Who would have thought it? Oh, my dearest Lizzie, how rich you are going to be! What jewels, what carriages and nice things you will have! Now, Bingley is all right, but Jane's is nothing to it. Nothing at all. I am so pleased, so happy. Such a charming man, so handsome, so tall. Oh, my dear Lizzie, please forgive me for disliking him so much before. Dear, dear Lizzie! A house in town, 3 daughters married, 10,000 a year. Oh, Lord, I shall go crazy." "I have to go to the library," said Elizabeth, moving to the door. "He is waiting in there for me." "Please ask him to stay to dinner," said Mrs. Bennet. "Find out what his favorite dish is, so that I may send out for it at once." The day went much better for Elizabeth than she expected.
Mrs. Bennet was so nervous about her future son-in-law that she hardly spoke to him. She only gave him her attention, or agreed with whatever he said. Elizabeth also saw that her father was making an effort to know Darcy better. Soon, Mr. Bennet let it be known to her that Darcy was a fine man. It was a happy day for Mrs. Bennet when she married off her two most deserving daughters. She spent a great deal of time boasting about their successes. As for Mr. Bennet, he missed his second daughter greatly. He often went to visit her at their house in Pemberley. He did this very often, as his feelings for Elizabeth were strong. Mr. Bingley and Jane remained at Netherfield for only 12 months. Despite Bingley's easy character and caring heart, it was too difficult to live so close to Jane's mother. He bought a house in a nearby area to Pemberley, and Jane and Elizabeth were only 30 miles from each other. Kitty began to spend most of her time with her two elder sisters. Here she had a chance to meet many high and educated people. Her improvement was great. Mary was the only daughter to remain at home, but she no longer had to worry about being compared in beauty to her sisters. She became more and more happy. Wickham and Lydia still continued to have problems. They were always moving from place to place and always spending more than they had. Their unsettled life often made them have too many bills, and whenever they had to move, either Jane or Elizabeth was sure of being asked for some help to pay their bills. Though Darcy would not receive Wickham at Pemberley, he did what he could to help him in his army job. Pemberley was now also Georgiana's home. She held the highest thoughts in the world for Elizabeth. At first, she was often surprised at Elizabeth's lively manner of talking to her brother. However, she soon began to understand that a woman may be more free in talk with her husband than with her brother. Lady Catherine was extremely upset with her nephew's marriage to Elizabeth. She wrote him such a rude letter that for a long time they did not see one another. Finally, his aunt's hatefulness ended, either because of her feelings for him or her curiosity to see his wife again. She finally lowered herself to visit them at Pemberley. Elizabeth and her husband were always on the friendliest terms with the Gardiners. They thought of them as the reason why they were brought together again. They were ever looking for ways to show their gratitude.